In the summer of 1997, the Brennan family set out for a 3-day hiking adventure in the Cascade Mountains of Washington state. David and Elena Brennan, along with their 12-year-old daughter Sophie and 8-year-old son Owen, checked into the ranger station at Glacier Peak Wilderness on a Friday morning. They were experienced hikers, well prepared, and excited for their annual family trip. But by Monday, when they failed to return, search and rescue teams found only their abandoned campsite. Sleeping bags laid out, food still in bear canisters, and all their gear untouched. It was as if the family of 4 had simply stood up mid-breakfast and walked into the forest, never to return. For 16 years, Elena's sister Caroline has searched for answers, haunted by the inexplicable disappearance. But when a wildfire in 2013 burns through a remote section of the wilderness, it exposes something that should have stayed buried. A discovery so disturbing, it suggests the Brennan family's fate was far worse than anyone imagined, and that perhaps some trails should never be followed. If you're drawn to mysteries that chill you to the bone, stay with us until the end. The truth about what happened on that mountain will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the wilderness and about human nature itself. The smoke from the Wolverine Creek fire had finally cleared after 3 weeks of burning through 12,000 acres of old-growth forest in the Cascade Mountain Range. Fire crews had worked around the clock to contain the blaze, and now, in early September 2013, rehabilitation teams were assessing the damage and planning restoration efforts. Tommy Reeves had been a wildland firefighter for 11 years, and he'd seen plenty of destruction in his time. Charred landscapes were part of the job, as was the occasional discovery of wildlife casualties. But what he found on a blackened ridge overlooking what used to be called Whispering Creek had nothing to do with the fire. The structure was barely visible at first, just the suggestion of geometric lines beneath the ash and debris. Tommy had almost walked past it entirely, focused on marking hazard trees, when something made him stop. A feeling, maybe. The forest had that quality after a fire, an eerie silence where even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He approached slowly, using his boot to clear away a layer of ash. What emerged made his stomach clench. Wooden planks, old and weathered, formed what looked like the beginnings of a trap door set into the earth. But that wasn't what made Tommy reach for his radio with shaking hands. It was the small pink shoe lying next to the partially exposed entrance. A child's hiking boot, its laces still tied, looking remarkably preserved despite what must have been years in the elements. Tommy had lived in the area his whole life. He knew the stories. Every local knew about the Brennan family, the mystery that had never been solved, the 4 people who'd vanished without a trace 16 years ago. He keyed his radio. "Base, this is Reeves. I need you to contact the county sheriff. I've found something on the North Ridge above Whispering Creek, something they're going to want to see." As he waited for a response, Tommy stared at the small shoe and the hidden entrance it guarded. The wind picked up, carrying the acrid smell of burnt timber, and somewhere in the distance, a raven called out. A harsh, lonely sound that seemed to carry a warning. Some secrets, Tommy thought, should stay buried. But this one was about to surface. Caroline Mercer stood in the kitchen of her Seattle home, staring at her phone as if the device itself had betrayed her. The voice on the other end belonged to Detective Sarah Holbrook of the Skagit County Sheriff's Office, and she was saying words that Caroline had both longed for and dreaded for 16 years. "Ms. Mercer, we found something in the Glacier Peak Wilderness that may be connected to your sister's case. I'd like you to come to the station when you're able." Caroline's hand tightened around the phone. "What did you find? I'd prefer to discuss the details in person." "Please," Caroline said, her voice barely steady. "I've been waiting 16 years. Just tell me. Did you find them? Did you find Elena and the children?" There was a pause on the line, and Caroline could hear papers rustling in the background. "We found evidence that suggests a structure was built in a remote area of the wilderness. very close to where your sister's family was last seen. The wildfire exposed it. There are items we believe belong to the Brennan family." Caroline closed her eyes, gripping the counter for support. "Are they alive?" "We don't know yet. The site is still being excavated. But Ms. Mercer, I need you to prepare yourself. What we've found so far indicates—" Detective Holbrook hesitated. "It indicates this wasn't a simple case of getting lost in the wilderness." 2 hours later, Caroline sat across from Detective Holbrook in a small conference room at the Skagit County Sheriff's Office. The detective was in her early 40s, with sharp eyes and an expression that managed to convey both professionalism and genuine sympathy. "Thank you for coming so quickly," Detective Holbrook said, sliding a folder across the table. "I want to be transparent with you about what we know, but I also need to warn you that some of this may be difficult to process." Caroline opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were photographs of a burned forest landscape. In several images, she could make out the remains of what looked like a wooden structure built into the side of a hill, almost like a root cellar or bunker. "This was found approximately 2 miles from the campsite where your sister's family was last seen in 1997, Detective Holbrook explained. "The structure was deliberately concealed and would have been nearly impossible to find under normal circumstances. The fire burned away decades of overgrowth." Caroline studied the photographs. "What is it? Some kind of shelter?" "We're still determining that. But Ms. Mercer, we found personal belongings inside. A child's backpack with the name Sophie Brennan written on the tag. Clothing that appears to match descriptions from the original missing persons report, and—" The detective paused. "We found a journal. It belonged to your sister." Caroline's breath caught. Elena kept a journal. It appears she wrote in it after the family disappeared. The entries are disturbing. She describes being held captive with her children, being moved between locations in the wilderness. Detective Holbrook leaned forward. "Ms. Mercer, we have reason to believe your sister and her family didn't die in 1997. They were taken, held against their will by someone who knew these mountains intimately." The room seemed to tilt. Caroline had imagined countless scenarios over the years. Bear attacks, falls, exposure, even murder. But kidnapping, captivity, in the middle of the wilderness. "That's impossible," Caroline whispered. "The search teams covered miles. They had helicopters, dogs. How could someone hide 4 people?" "These mountains are vast," Detective Holbrook said quietly. "And there are people who live off the grid, people who know places even experienced rangers don't know about. We're looking into individuals who were in the area in 1997, anyone with a history of wilderness survival skills or suspicious behavior." Caroline's mind raced back to that summer, to the last conversation she'd had with Elena. They'd spoken on the phone the night before the hiking trip. Elena had been excited, talking about teaching Sophie to identify bird calls and letting Owen practice with his new compass. There had been no fear in her voice, no premonition of danger. "The journal," Caroline said, her throat tight. "What else did it say?" Detective Holbrook's expression grew more guarded. "The entries are fragmentary. Your sister was clearly under extreme stress. She mentions a man she refers to only as the shepherd. She describes being moved through underground passages, being kept in darkness. She talks about trying to protect the children, about David attempting to escape." "Attempting?" Caroline's voice cracked. "There's an entry from approximately 3 months after the disappearance. Your sister writes that David was caught trying to lead the children out through a tunnel. She doesn't describe what happened to him after that, but—" Detective Holbrook met Caroline's eyes. "Her subsequent entries only mention the children. David isn't referenced again." Caroline felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she forced them back. She'd learned long ago that grief was a luxury she couldn't afford. Grief meant accepting they were gone. Instead, she'd chosen anger, obsession, the relentless pursuit of answers. "How long do the entries continue?" she asked. "The last dated entry is from December 1997, 6 months after the disappearance. But there are undated entries that appear to have been written later, The handwriting becomes less steady, more erratic. Your sister writes about illness, about the children growing weaker, about something she calls the feeding time, and the lessons. Caroline's stomach turned. What does that mean? We don't know yet. The journal is with forensic analysts. We're hoping to extract more information, possibly find fingerprints other than your sister's. Detective Holbrook pulled out another photograph. There's something else. In the last pages of the journal, your sister drew a map. The photograph showed a hand-drawn sketch on lined paper. Caroline recognized Elena's handwriting immediately. The same careful printing she'd used since childhood. The map depicted what looked like a series of connected chambers or rooms, with notations like entry point, water source, and deepest chamber. We believe this is a map of the underground structure where they were held, Detective Holbrook said. We've already sent a team to begin exploring the site, using this as a guide. It's possible there are remains. She stopped herself. It's possible we'll find more answers. Caroline stared at the map, her sister's final act of desperate documentation. You think they're dead? I think we need to prepare for that possibility. But until we have concrete evidence, we're treating this as an active investigation. Detective Holbrook closed the folder. I need to ask you some questions about your sister's life before the disappearance. Anything that might help us understand who could have targeted this family. For the next hour, Caroline answered questions she'd answered a dozen times before, but now with new purpose. She described Elena and David's marriage. Solid, loving, no enemies she knew of. She talked about the children, Sophie's love of nature photography, and Owen's collection of interesting rocks. She mentioned David's job as an architect, Elena's work as a substitute teacher, their quiet life in Bellingham. Was there anyone who showed unusual interest in the family? Detective Holbrook asked. Anyone who might have known about their hiking plans? Caroline thought back. Elena posted about the trip on an online hiking forum she frequented. She liked to get trail recommendations from other hikers. Detective Holbrook made a note. Do you remember which forum? Northwest Trails and Adventures, I think. She'd been a member for years. We'll look into that. What about when they checked in at the ranger station? Did your sister mention meeting anyone unusual? She called me that Friday evening, after they'd set up camp. She said they'd passed a few other hikers on the trail but hadn't talked to anyone at length. She mentioned... Caroline paused, a memory surfacing. She said Owen thought he saw someone watching them from the trees while they were eating dinner. Elena dismissed it as Owen's imagination. He was 8, always seeing things. Detective Holbrook leaned forward. Did she describe what Owen saw? Just a man standing very still in the shadows. Elena said she looked but didn't see anyone. She figured it was the way the evening light played through the trees. The detective wrote something down, underlining it twice. Ms. Mercer, I want to be clear with you about something. This investigation is going to attract media attention. The discovery of the journal, the structure. This is going to become a major story. You may want to prepare yourself for that. Caroline had dealt with media attention before, in the immediate aftermath of the disappearance and again on the 10th anniversary. She'd given interviews, made appeals, appeared on missing persons shows. But this felt different. This wasn't speculation anymore. This was evidence of horror. I don't care about the media, Caroline said firmly. I only care about finding out what happened to my sister and her family. And if someone took them, if someone hurt them. Her voice hardened. I want them found. I want them to answer for what they did. Detective Holbrook nodded. That's what we all want. We're going to find the truth, Ms. Mercer, whatever it takes. As Caroline left the sheriff's office, stepping out into the cool September afternoon, she felt the weight of 16 years pressing down on her shoulders. She'd never given up hope, never stopped searching. She'd hiked every trail Elena had planned to take, posted on internet forums, hired private investigators with money she didn't have, and driven herself to the edge of madness with what-ifs. Now, finally, she had something concrete. A journal. A map. Evidence that her sister had survived, at least for a while. Evidence that something truly terrible had happened in those mountains. She got into her car and sat for a moment, staring at the mountains visible in the distance. The same mountains that had swallowed her sister's family whole. Somewhere up there, in the burned forest, the earth was giving up its secrets. Caroline pulled out her phone and called her husband. "Mark, they found something. Something bad. I'm going to need you to take the kids this weekend. I have to go up there. I have to see where they found her things." As she spoke, she didn't notice the pickup truck parked 3 spaces down, or the man behind the wheel watching her with intense, unblinking eyes. The man who'd been waiting 16 years for this day, knowing it would eventually come, knowing that fires cleanse, but they also reveal. He started his engine and pulled out of the parking lot, disappearing into traffic before Caroline ended her call. The drive to the Glacier Peak Wilderness took Caroline 3 hours, winding through increasingly remote roads until pavement gave way to gravel, and finally to a dirt access road marked with official vehicles. She'd left at dawn, unable to sleep after her meeting with Detective Holbrook, her mind cycling through images of Elena's journal and that haunting map. Yellow crime scene tape cordoned off a section of forest where the fire had burned through most intensely. Caroline parked behind a sheriff's SUV and approached the checkpoint, where a young deputy stood guard. "I'm Caroline Mercer," she said, showing the identification Detective Holbrook had given her. "I'm authorized to be here." The deputy checked his clipboard and nodded. "Detective Holbrook said you'd be coming. She's up at the site. Follow the marked path, about a quarter mile." The smell of burnt wood hung heavy in the air as Caroline made her way up the trail. Blackened tree trunks stood like sentinels, their branches reduced to skeletal fingers reaching toward a gray sky. In places, the fire had burned so hot that the earth itself looked scorched, turned to a surface of ash and char. She found Detective Holbrook standing with a forensic team near what remained of the hidden structure. In the daylight, Caroline could see it more clearly. A wooden framework built into the hillside, designed to look like a natural outcropping. Most of the wood had been consumed by the fire, but the earthen chambers beneath had survived, their openings now exposed like wounds in the ground. "Ms. Mercer," Detective Holbrook greeted her, stepping away from the team. "I appreciate you waiting until we processed the initial evidence before coming up here." "What have you found?" Caroline asked, unable to take her eyes off the dark openings in the earth. "Come with me, but I need to warn you. This is disturbing." They approached the largest of the exposed chambers. A ladder had been set up leading down into darkness, with generator-powered lights illuminating the space below. Caroline could see that the chamber had been carved out of the earth and reinforced with timber, creating a room roughly 15 feet square. "We believe this was the main living area," Detective Holbrook explained. "We found the journal here, along with blankets, some preserved food containers, and children's items. The person who built this knew what they were doing. The chambers were designed to maintain temperature and humidity, and to be virtually undetectable from the surface." Caroline peered down into the chamber. Even with the lights, there was something deeply unsettling about the space, the way it had been hidden from the sky, from help, from hope. "How many chambers are there?" she asked. "We've found 5 so far, connected by narrow passages. The map in your sister's journal indicates there should be 7. We're still excavating." Detective Holbrook paused. "Ms. Mercer, we found something in the deepest chamber. I need you to identify if you can." They moved to a smaller opening at the far end of the site. This entrance had been more carefully preserved by the forensic team, as if they were being especially cautious about what it might contain. A photographer was documenting everything before items were removed. "We found human remains," Detective Holbrook said quietly. "Adult male, based on preliminary assessment. The body was in a section of the chamber that collapsed, possibly decades ago. We won't have a positive ID until we run DNA tests, but..." She held up a sealed evidence bag. Inside was a watch, the band broken but the face still intact. "Do you recognize this?" Caroline took the bag with shaking hands. The watch was a Timex with a distinctive blue face and silver band. She'd been with Elena when Elena bought it for David on their 10th anniversary, just 2 months before the hiking trip. "That's David's watch," she whispered. "Elena had it engraved on the back. 10 years, forever to go." Detective Holbrook nodded solemnly. "We'll verify the engraving." "I'm sorry, Ms. Mercer. I know this isn't the outcome anyone wanted." Caroline stared at the watch, thinking about what Elena had written in the journal. David attempting to escape. David no longer being mentioned in later entries. Now she understood why. "He tried to save them," she said, her voice hollow. "He tried to get the children out, and whoever did this killed him for it." "That's our working theory. The collapse that buried him appears to have been deliberate. We found evidence of tools, of the ceiling being intentionally compromised." Detective Holbrook touched Caroline's arm gently. "Come sit down. This is a lot to process." They moved to a makeshift command station set up in a clearing, where Caroline sank onto a folding chair. One of the forensic team members brought her a bottle of water, which she accepted numbly. "What about Elena and the children?" Caroline asked. "Have you found any other remains?" "Not yet, but there are still chambers we haven't fully explored. The map indicates passages that go deeper into the hillside, and we've found evidence of cave-ins and flooding in some sections. It's going to take time." Caroline opened the water bottle but didn't drink. "Tell me about the journal. What else did Elena write?" Detective Holbrook sat down across from her, pulling out a tablet. "I've had the journal scanned so we could preserve the original. I can show you some of the entries if you think you're ready." "I need to know." The detective pulled up a scanned image. Caroline recognized Elena's handwriting immediately. Neat, controlled, so familiar it made her chest ache. The entry was dated August 3rd, 1997, 2 weeks after the family's disappearance. "Sophie keeps asking when we can go home. I don't know how to tell her that I don't know if we ever will. The shepherd says we're being prepared for something important, that we were chosen." David doesn't believe him. Every night after the shepherd leaves, David examines the walls, looking for weaknesses. He thinks there's a way out through the water tunnel, the one that floods when it rains. "I'm terrified he's going to try it and drown. I'm terrified we're all going to die down here in the dark." Caroline's vision blurred with tears. She was so scared. The entries continue in that vein for several weeks. Detective Holbrook said. She documents their daily routine. The shepherd would bring food and water, sometimes stay for hours talking about wilderness philosophy, survival of the worthy, things that suggest possible mental illness or a distorted belief system. Your sister tried to keep the children's spirits up, created games for them, told them stories. What happened to David? Caroline forced herself to ask. Detective Holbrook scrolled to another entry, dated September 15th, 1997. Your sister writes about David's escape attempt. It was late at night. He'd managed to remove some of the timber reinforcing one of the passages and thought he'd found a way to the surface. He got the children halfway through before... She paused. Before the shepherd discovered them. Caroline waited, her heart hammering. Elena doesn't describe what happened in detail. She just writes, David is gone, the children are back. The shepherd says this is what happens to those who reject his gift of shelter. We must learn to be grateful. After that, she never mentions David again. The horror of it settled over Caroline like a physical weight. Her brother-in-law, a good man who'd loved his family, who'd worked in a profession dedicated to building safe spaces for people to live, had died trying to save his children in a nightmare he couldn't architect his way out of. The shepherd, Caroline said, forcing her voice to stay steady. Do you have any leads on who he might be? We're investigating several possibilities. We're looking at individuals who lived in this area in the 90s. Anyone with known survivalist tendencies or who'd been reported for suspicious behavior in the wilderness. We're also reviewing the forum Elena posted on before the trip. checking if anyone showed unusual interest in her family's plans. Detective Holbrook set down the tablet. There's something else. In some of the later entries, your sister becomes less lucid. She writes about the lessons the shepherd was teaching, about how Sophie had to learn to be grateful, about how Owen wasn't adapting as well as the shepherd wanted. What does that mean? We're not entirely sure, but some of the phrasing suggests. Detective Holbrook chose her words carefully. It suggests the shepherd may have had specific plans for the children, educational or indoctrination purposes. Your sister writes about having to watch while Sophie was taken to the learning chamber, and how she could hear Owen crying from another section of the structure. Caroline pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting nausea. He was torturing them, psychologically torturing children. It appears that way, yes. A shout came from the excavation site. One of the forensic team members was waving urgently. Detective Holbrook stood immediately. "Wait here." But Caroline followed, unable to stay away. She reached the edge of the largest chamber just as a technician climbed up the ladder, his face pale. "We found another chamber," he said, slightly out of breath. "Behind a false wall in the deepest section. Detective, you need to see this." They descended into the underground structure, the temperature dropping noticeably as they went deeper. Caroline's claustrophobia kicked in. The walls seemed to press inward, the ceiling to lower with each step. How had Elena survived down here? How had the children coped with this darkness? The technician led them through a narrow passage that required them to duck and move sideways. Caroline's breathing quickened, her heart racing. Then they emerged into a slightly larger space, lit by portable work lights. The chamber was different from the others. The walls had been carved with symbols, crude drawings of trees, animals, and humanoid figures that seemed to dance in the flickering light. In the center of the room stood a small table made of stone, and on it were arranged items that made Caroline's blood run cold. Children's drawings, dozens of them, preserved in plastic sleeves, photographs of Sophie and Owen, taken at different ages, and in the corner, a child's skeleton, curled into a fetal position, a small bracelet still clasped around tiny wrist bones. Detective Holbrook moved closer to examine the bracelet, then looked at Caroline with an expression of profound sorrow. "Ms. Mercer, did your niece Sophie wear a bracelet? Something she wouldn't have taken off?" Caroline's knees buckled. She knew that bracelet. She'd given it to Sophie for her 10th birthday, 2 years before the disappearance. It was silver with a charm shaped like a camera, because Sophie had loved photography. "That's Sophie," Caroline whispered, the words tearing from her throat. "Oh God, that's Sophie!" She turned and stumbled back through the passage, desperate for air, for light, for anything that wasn't this tomb where her niece had died. She made it to the surface and collapsed onto her knees in the ash, retching as sobs racked her body. Detective Holbrook emerged a moment later, kneeling beside her. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry you had to see that." "She was 12, Caroline choked out. "She was just a child. How could someone—" She couldn't finish. There were no words for what had been done to her family. They sat in the burned forest for a long time, Caroline crying in a way she hadn't allowed herself to cry in 16 years. All that time hoping, searching, believing that somehow, somewhere, they'd survived. And now this nightmare confirmation. Eventually her tears subsided into numb exhaustion. "Owen," she said hoarsely. "And Elena? Have you found them?" "Not yet," Detective Holbrook said quietly. But the journal had later entries, undated ones. "Your sister was alive for some time after Sophie, after we lost Sophie. And she mentions Owen being moved to a different location, somewhere the shepherd called the sanctuary." Caroline looked up sharply. "Different location? You mean there might be more structures like this?" "It's possible. The map in the journal shows these chambers, but there are notations on the edges, references to the old place and the sanctuary." We think the shepherd may have had multiple sites throughout the wilderness. The implications were staggering. Not just one underground prison, but a network of them. How many people might this person have taken over the years? How many families had stories like the Brennans? "We need to find him," Caroline said, standing on shaky legs. "We need to find the shepherd. He could still be out there." "We're working on it," Detective Holbrook assured her. "But Ms. Mercer, you need to prepare yourself for what we might find. Your sister's last entries suggest she was seriously ill. She writes about being unable to keep food down, about fever and confusion. And Owen," she hesitated. "She writes about Owen differently in the later entries, like he'd changed somehow, like he'd stopped resisting." The thought of her 8-year-old nephew being broken by captivity, of his bright curiosity being crushed into submission, was almost more than Caroline could bear. "I want to read the journal," she said. "All of it. Everything Elena wrote. I'll arrange that, but not today. You should go home, be with your family. This investigation is going to take weeks, maybe months. You need to take care of yourself." Caroline knew the detective was right, but the thought of leaving felt like abandonment. Her sister had died in these mountains, along with Sophie and David. Owen's fate was still unknown. How could she just drive away? As if reading her thoughts, Detective Holbrook said, "Your sister documented everything she could in that journal. She drew maps, described the shepherd, recorded details that are helping us build a profile. She fought to leave us answers. The best way to honor that is to let us do our job. We'll find the truth, and we'll find whoever did this." Caroline nodded slowly, taking one last look at the excavation site. Somewhere under that burned earth, her sister had lived and died. But she'd left a message, a trail of breadcrumbs for someone to follow. "Call me the moment you find anything else," Caroline said. "Anything at all." "I will, I promise." As Caroline walked back to her car, she passed the area where they'd found Sophie's remains being carefully documented and prepared for transport. A small pink hair tie lay among the evidence, and Caroline remembered buying it with Sophie at a drugstore, the girl insisting on that exact shade of pink. She got in her car and sat for a moment, staring at the mountains that had taken everything from her. Then she pulled out her phone and called her husband again. "Mark, they found Sophie," she said when he answered. "She's dead. They're still looking for Elena and Owen." She heard his sharp intake of breath. "Caroline, I'm so sorry. Are you okay? Do you need me to come get you?" "No, I'm driving back now. But Mark, I need you to help me with something. I need to research everyone who was in this area in 1997. Hikers, guides, rangers, anyone. There are records somewhere, forum posts, ranger station logs, permits. Someone saw this man. Someone knows who he is." "Caroline, I have to do this," she said firmly. "Elena left a journal. She documented everything she could. Now it's my turn to finish what she started." As she ended the call and started her car, Caroline didn't see the figure standing in the trees at the edge of the burned zone, watching her through binoculars. Didn't see him lower the binoculars and smile. The shepherd had been watching Caroline for 16 years, just as he'd watched Elena before her. Some people, he believed, were meant to find their way to him. They just didn't know it yet. He turned and disappeared into the unburned forest, moving with the practiced silence of someone who'd spent decades learning every trail, every hidden path, every secret these mountains held. The fire had exposed one of his places, but he had others. And if Caroline Mercer wanted to find him so badly, well, the shepherd had always appreciated visitors who came willingly into the wilderness. Caroline spent the next 3 days in a haze of grief and obsessive research. She'd taken leave from her job as a legal assistant, told her children that Aunt Elena's case had developments she needed to focus on, and converted her home office into a makeshift investigation room. The walls were now covered with printouts, maps, timelines, and photographs, both old and new. Mark brought her coffee at odd hours, gently reminding her to eat, to sleep, to remember she had a life outside this tragedy. But Caroline couldn't stop. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that small skeleton curled in the dark. The bracelet she'd given Sophie still clutched around bone-thin wrist. Detective Holbrook had sent over copies of Elena's journal entries as promised, along with a warning to contact a therapist if the content became too overwhelming. Caroline read every word. Some entries multiple times, searching for clues hidden in her sister's desperate documentation. The entries painted a picture of systematic psychological torture. The shepherd, Elena never learned his real name, would keep the family in darkness for days, then flood the chambers with bright lantern light. He'd withhold food until they thanked him properly for his protection from the dangerous world above. He lectured them about how civilization had corrupted humanity, how only those who could survive in the pure wilderness deserved to continue existing. But it was the entries about the children that haunted Caroline most. October 22nd, 1997. The shepherd took Sophie to the learning chamber again today. She was gone for 6 hours. When she came back, she wouldn't speak, wouldn't look at me, just curled up with her blanket and stared at the wall. Owen asked what the shepherd does in the learning chamber, but Sophie won't say. I think it's better he doesn't know. I think it's better I don't know. I can't bear to imagine. November 8th, 1997. Owen is getting thinner. The shepherd says he's too weak, too attached to soft living. He makes Owen do exercises until he collapses, then refuses to give him water until he can complete them. My son is 8 years old. 8. And this monster is trying to break him like an animal. David, if you can hear me wherever you are, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect them. December 15th, 1997. Sophie is gone. The shepherd came this morning and took her to what he calls the final chamber. She's been gone all day. Owen keeps asking when she'll be back. I don't know what to tell him. I don't know if she's coming back. That was the last dated entry. After that, the journal became fragmentary, undated. Elena's handwriting deteriorating from neat script to frantic scrawl. Owen doesn't cry anymore. The shepherd says he's finally learning. I see my son becoming something else, something silent and hollow. Better that than dead. Better that than what happened to Sophie in that final chamber. I can't write what I found. I can't. God forgive me for not protecting her. Sick again. Fever won't break. The shepherd brings medicine, but it doesn't help. Owen sits with me but doesn't speak. He watches me the way the shepherd watches us, like I'm an animal, like I'm prey. The shepherd says Owen is ready to move to the sanctuary. Says he's learned the most important lesson, how to survive by any means necessary. I asked what that means. He smiled, said I'd understand soon enough. Said Owen has a gift for adaptation. I don't recognize my son anymore. The final entry was barely legible, the letters shaky and uneven. Owen gone to sanctuary, alone now, so cold. Can hear water rising. Shepherd hasn't come in days, weeks. Time strange. If someone finds this, tell Caroline I tried. Tell her I loved my babies. Tell her some of us don't die all at once. Some of us die in pieces until there's nothing left to die. Caroline had read that final entry a dozen times, tears blurring the words. Her sister had died alone in the dark, sick and abandoned, believing she'd failed her children. The cruelty of it was incomprehensible. Now, 3 days after seeing Sophie's remains, Caroline sat at her computer with a renewed sense of purpose. Detective Holbrook's team was investigating from an official capacity, but Caroline had something they didn't. Intimate knowledge of Elena's habits, her way of thinking, the small details she might have included in online posts that would mean nothing to strangers. She logged into the Northwest Trails and Adventures Forum, the hiking community Elena had been part of for years. The website looked dated, clearly not updated since the late 90s, but it was still active. Caroline had created an account using her own name and started combing through old posts. It took her several hours to find Elena's original thread from June 1997, titled Family Hiking Trip, Glacier Peak Area, Route Suggestions. Elena's post was cheerful and detailed, describing the family's experience level, the children's ages, and their plan for a 3-day trip in late July. She listed the specific trails they were considering and asked for recommendations on campsites suitable for families with children. Caroline scrolled through the responses. Most were helpful and straightforward. Suggestions for scenic spots, warnings about bear activity, recommendations for water filtration. But one username appeared multiple times, TrailWatcher77. His first response had been helpful enough, suggesting a campsite near Whispering Creek with good access to water and relatively flat ground for setting up tents. But his follow-up posts had a different quality. TrailWatcher77. You mentioned your daughter likes photography. The area around Whispering Creek has some interesting rock formations just off the main trail, about a quarter-mile north. Not many people know about them. Your family might enjoy exploring there. TrailWatcher77. I'm curious about your son's rock collection. Does he prefer sedimentary or igneous specimens? The Glacier Peak area has some unique geological features I could point you toward if you're interested in educational opportunities. TrailWatcher77. How long have you been teaching your children wilderness survival skills? It's refreshing to see a family taking outdoor education seriously. Too many parents these days raise their children to be dependent on technology and comfort. Caroline felt her skin prickle. The posts were polite, helpful even, but there was something in the way TrailWatcher77 focused on the children, asked specific questions about them, praised Elena's parenting style that set off alarm bells. She clicked on his profile. He'd been a member since 1995 and had posted extensively about wilderness survival, primitive camping, and what he called authentic living, rejecting modern conveniences in favor of traditional skills. Many of his posts had an almost evangelical quality, arguing that civilization was corrupting humanity and that only those willing to embrace hardship and isolation could achieve true enlightenment. Caroline grabbed her phone and called Detective Holbrook. I found something, she said as soon as the detective answered. On the hiking forum, there was a user who showed unusual interest in Elena's family before the trip. I'm listening. Caroline read through the relevant posts, explaining her concerns about the specific focus on the children and the ideology that matched what Elena had described in her journal. Can you send me screenshots of everything? Detective Holbrook asked. We'll have our tech team trace the account, see if we can identify who was behind it. There's more, Caroline said, still scrolling through TrailWatcher77's post history. He made posts in other threads too. There's one from 1995 about a solo hiker who went missing in the North Cascades. He claimed to have information about what happened to her, but said he'd only share it with people worthy of understanding the wilderness's judgment. What was the hiker's name? Caroline checked the thread title. Rebecca Marsh. She was a 23-year-old woman from Oregon who disappeared during a solo backpacking trip. She heard typing on the other end of the line. Rebecca Marsh was never found, Detective Holbrook said. Her case is still open. Ms. Mercer, this could be significant. If the same person who posted as TrailWatcher77 was involved in multiple disappearances, then the Brennans weren't his only victims, Caroline finished. He could have been doing this for years. Send me everything you have. I'm going to contact the FBI. If this is a serial predator operating across multiple jurisdictions, we need federal involvement. After ending the call, Caroline continued digging through the forum. She found more threads where TrailWatcher77 had interacted with hikers planning trips to remote areas. Not all of them led to disappearances. Most people probably hiked their routes and returned home safely. But there were patterns. He seemed to focus on families with children, solo female hikers, and people who expressed interest in primitive camping or extended wilderness stays. He always offered local knowledge and off-trail suggestions. He praised people who wanted to disconnect from civilization and challenge themselves in harsh conditions. Caroline created a spreadsheet, documenting every thread, every user Trailwatcher 77 had interacted with, every recommendation he'd made. Then she started cross-referencing with missing persons cases in Washington state. The results made her stomach turn. Between 1995 and 2000, 7 people who'd posted on Northwest Trails and Adventures had gone missing in the North Cascades. Not all had interacted directly with Trailwatcher 77, but all had posted in threads he'd participated in. All had expressed interest in remote hiking or primitive camping, and none had ever been found. Caroline was so absorbed in her research that she didn't notice the time until Mark knocked softly on her office door. "Caroline, it's almost midnight. You need to get some sleep." She looked up, realizing her eyes were burning from staring at the screen. "Mark, I think I found him. I think I found the shepherd." He came into the room, looking at the wall covered in her research, the spreadsheet on her screen. "Did you tell the police?" "Yes, but I'm not done. There's so much information here, so many connections. If I can just—" "Caroline." He knelt beside her chair, taking her hands. "You're exhausted. You've barely eaten in 3 days. I know you need answers, but you're going to make yourself sick." She wanted to argue, but the concern in his eyes stopped her. "I just keep thinking about Elena down there in the dark, writing in that journal, hoping someone would find it. She left breadcrumbs for me, Mark. She knew I'd never stop looking. And you haven't. You've found crucial information that the police are acting on. But you can't do this alone, and you can't do it without taking care of yourself." Caroline nodded reluctantly. "Okay, I'll try to sleep." But after Mark left, she couldn't help taking one more look at Trailwatcher 77's profile. His last post was from September 2013, just weeks ago, right after the wildfire. Trailwatcher 77. Fires cleanse the forest, but also expose what was hidden. Nature has a way of revealing the truth when the time is right. Those who understand the wilderness know that some secrets are meant to surface. The post had been made 2 days before Tommy Reeves found the hidden structure. It was as if Trailwatcher 77 had known what the fire would reveal, as if he'd been waiting for it. Caroline's phone buzzed with a text from Detective Holbrook. Tech team traced the account. It was created using a public library computer in Bellingham. Different computers each time he posted. Smart. He knew how to cover his tracks, but we're reviewing library security footage from 1997. It's a long shot, but we might get lucky. Caroline texted back. His last post was right before the structure was found. He knew the fire would expose it. The response came quickly. "I saw that. We're working on the theory that he's still in the area, still monitoring the situation. Caroline, I need you to be careful. If this is who we think it is, he's dangerous and he's been evading capture for decades. Don't do anything on your own." Caroline sent a confirmation text, but couldn't shake the unsettled feeling creeping over her. Trailwatcher 77 had watched Elena online, had guided her family toward a specific campsite near his hidden structure. Had he watched them set up camp that Friday evening? Had he been the figure Owen saw in the trees? She pulled up Elena's forum posts again, reading them with new eyes. Her sister's enthusiasm for the trip, her gratitude for Trailwatcher 77's suggestions, her mention of the children's interests. All of it now felt like bait being taken by a predator. One detail caught her attention. In her final post before the trip, Elena had written, "Thanks everyone for the great suggestions. We're definitely checking out those rock formations Trailwatcher 77 mentioned. Owen is already packing his rock hammer. See you all when we get back." The rock formations a quarter-mile north of the trail. That was where the hidden structure had been found. Trailwatcher 77 had lured them directly to his trap. Caroline stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness. Somewhere out there, the man who destroyed her family was watching and waiting. He'd posted on the forum after the fire, which meant he was still monitoring it, still engaged with the hiking community. An idea formed in her mind. Dangerous, probably foolish, but potentially effective. She sat back down at the computer and created a new thread on the forum. Subject: looking for information about my sister's 1997 disappearance. My name is Caroline Mercer. In July 1997, my sister Elena Brennan and her family disappeared during a hiking trip in the Glacier Peak Wilderness. Recently, evidence has been found suggesting they were held captive. I'm trying to understand what happened to them. If anyone has information about unusual activity in that area during the late 1990s, or knew anyone who spent significant time in the remote sections of the North Cascades, please contact me. I'm particularly interested in connecting with Trail Watcher 77, who gave my sister hiking suggestions before her trip. Any information could help bring closure to my family. She included her email address and hit post before she could second-guess herself. Mark would be furious if he knew what she'd just done. Detective Holbrook would probably be angry too, but Caroline needed to do something active, something that might draw the shepherd out. If he was still monitoring the forum, he'd see her post. And maybe, just maybe, his ego or curiosity would compel him to respond. She refreshed her email every few minutes for the next hour, but no new messages appeared. Finally, exhausted, she shut down her computer and went to bed. But sleep was elusive. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Owen's face from family photographs, superimposed with the haunting words from Elena's journal. Owen doesn't cry anymore. I don't recognize my son anymore. The shepherd says he's learned the most important lesson. What had happened to Owen in that underground prison? Where was the sanctuary the shepherd had mentioned? And, most disturbing of all, was it possible Owen was still alive somewhere? Caroline's phone buzzed on the nightstand. She grabbed it, expecting a message from Detective Holbrook about the forum post. Instead, it was from an unknown number. A text message with no words, just a photograph. The image showed a young man, probably in his early 20s, standing in a dense forest. He was thin, with dark hair and a hollow expression. He wasn't looking at the camera but staring off to the side, as if watching something in the trees. The photograph was dated. The timestamp in the corner read September 18, 2013, 3 days ago. Caroline's hands shook as she enlarged the image, studying the young man's features. She hadn't seen Owen since he was 8 years old, but there was something in the shape of his face, the set of his eyes, that reminded her of David. Could it possibly be? Another text arrived. Some children adapt. Some become something new. The wilderness teaches those willing to learn. Caroline called the number immediately, but it went straight to a disconnected message. She texted back, "Who is this? Is that Owen?" No response came. She forwarded the messages to Detective Holbrook with shaking fingers, then sat staring at the photograph until her vision blurred. If that was Owen, he'd survived. He was alive, but the hollow look in his eyes suggested that whatever he'd endured had fundamentally changed him. The shepherd had sent her this. She was certain of it. He'd seen her forum post and responded in his own way, showing her that he still had power, still had control over at least one member of her sister's family. Caroline didn't sleep at all that night. She sat in the darkness, studying the photograph, committing every detail to memory, and making a silent promise to Elena. I will find him. I will find your son. And I will make the shepherd answer for what he's done. Detective Holbrook arrived at Caroline's house at 7 in the morning, accompanied by an FBI agent named Marcus Torres. Caroline had been awake for hours, sitting at her kitchen table with the photograph still displayed on her phone, studying it obsessively for any clue about where it might have been taken. Ms. Mercer, Agent Torres said as they settled around the table, I need you to walk me through exactly what happened last night, every detail. Caroline explained about the forum post, about checking her email and then receiving the texts. Agent Torres examined the photograph on her phone, his expression grave. We'll need your phone to extract the full metadata from this image, he said. Sometimes photographs contain GPS coordinates or other identifying information that can tell us where they were taken. "Do you think that's really Owen?" Caroline asked, unable to keep the desperate hope from her voice. "The age would be about right," Detective Holbrook said carefully. "Owen would be 24 now, and this young man appears to be in his early 20s. But we won't know for certain without DNA comparison or other definitive identification." Agent Torres leaned back in his chair. "Miss Mercer, I need to be direct with you. Posting on that forum was extremely risky. If this is the same person who held your sister's family captive, you've now put yourself on his radar. He knows who you are, where to find you, and that you're actively investigating." "I had to do something," Caroline said. "I couldn't just sit here waiting while he's out there. I understand the impulse, but this individual has successfully evaded law enforcement for potentially decades. He's intelligent, patient, and extremely dangerous. The fact that he responded to your post within hours suggests he monitors that forum regularly. He may have been monitoring it for years, looking for new potential victims." The thought made Caroline's skin crawl. While she'd been researching, posting on the forum, he'd been watching her do it. "What's our next move?" she asked. "We've set up monitoring on your forum account and email," Detective Holbrook explained. "If he contacts you again, we'll trace it. In the meantime, we need to understand more about what happened in those chambers. The excavation has revealed additional details that might help us identify who we're looking for." Agent Torres pulled out a tablet, bringing up photographs from the excavation site. "We found evidence that the structure was built over several years, possibly starting in the early 1990s. The construction shows sophisticated knowledge of engineering, wilderness survival, and psychology. The learning chamber your sister mentioned in her journal was designed for sensory deprivation and manipulation. We found restraints, audio equipment for playing recorded sounds, and evidence of temperature control." Caroline felt sick. "What kind of sounds?" "Recordings of forest noises, animal calls, wind, rain, but also human voices. We're analyzing them now, but initial review suggests they were meant to disorient and confuse, creating an environment where captives couldn't distinguish between real and recorded sounds, day and night, inside and outside." "Psychological torture," Caroline said quietly. "Exactly. This wasn't just about physical captivity. Whoever built this place wanted to break down his victims' sense of reality, make them dependent on him for basic information about their own environment." Detective Holbrook pulled up another image. "We also found something else, tools that were used for carving those symbols we saw in the final chamber. They were high quality, well maintained, the kind of tools a professional craftsman or artist would use." "So we're looking for someone with artistic or craftsman skills?" Caroline asked. "Possibly, or someone who values precision and detail. The symbols themselves appear to be a personal mythology, a combination of indigenous petroglyphs, Christian imagery, and what our consultant believes are original creations. Whoever made them was trying to communicate something about their belief system." Agent Torres swiped to a close-up of one of the carvings. It showed a human figure standing among trees, with other smaller figures kneeling before it. This motif appears repeatedly, a shepherd figure with followers. The dominant figure always has its arms outstretched, as if offering protection or demanding worship. Caroline studied the image, thinking about the entries in Elena's journal. The shepherd had seen himself as a protector, saving worthy people from the corruption of civilization. In his twisted worldview, he was doing them a favor by imprisoning them. "Have you been able to identify any of his other potential victims?" she asked. "We're working on it," Agent Torres replied. "The 7 missing persons cases you identified from the forum are being reinvestigated. We've also started looking at unsolved disappearances throughout the Pacific Northwest, dating back to the early 1990s. The pattern suggests he may have started with solo hikers, easier targets, less likely to be immediately missed, before escalating to families." "Why families?" The question had haunted Caroline since she'd first learned the truth. What would make someone target entire families? "Control," Agent Torres said simply. "When you take a family, you have leverage. Parents will do anything to protect their children. Children will comply to protect their parents. It creates a web of fear and dependency that's easier to manipulate than a single individual who only has themselves to worry about. The doorbell rang, making Caroline jump. Detective Holbrook stood immediately. "Were you expecting anyone?" "No." The detective moved to the front window and looked out, her hand instinctively going to her weapon. Then she relaxed slightly. "It's a delivery truck. You expecting a package?" Caroline shook her head. They all moved toward the front door together. Through the window, Caroline could see a courier truck pulling away from the curb. Detective Holbrook opened the door carefully. On the porch sat a small cardboard box, addressed to Caroline Mercer with no return address. The detective pulled on gloves before picking it up. "It's light," she said, gently shaking it. Something shifted inside with a soft rustling sound. "Should we call a bomb squad?" Caroline asked, suddenly terrified. "Let me check it first." Detective Holbrook produced a knife and carefully cut the tape, opening the box while Agent Torres stood ready. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a small item wrapped in plastic. The detective lifted it out carefully. Through the plastic, Caroline could see what looked like a child's toy, a small compass with a cracked face and a faded strap. "Owen's compass," Caroline whispered. "Elena gave it to him for Christmas the year before they disappeared. He took it everywhere." Detective Holbrook laid the package on the porch and photographed it from multiple angles before carefully opening the plastic. The compass was definitely old, weathered from years of exposure. Attached to it with a rubber band was a small piece of paper. The note was handwritten in neat, precise letters. "He who loses his way in the wilderness can either perish or become wilderness himself. Owen chose wisely." "Will you?" Caroline's knees went weak. Mark, who'd been hovering in the doorway, caught her elbow. "What does that mean? Is he threatening you?" "It's an invitation," Agent Torres said grimly. "He's telling Ms. Mercer that Owen survived by adapting to captivity, by becoming what the shepherd wanted him to be. And he's challenging her to follow, to come looking for answers in the wilderness." "That's insane," Mark said. "Caroline, you can't seriously consider—" "We need to trace this delivery," Detective Holbrook interrupted, already on her phone. "Find out which courier service, where it was dropped off, everything." While she made calls, Caroline stared at Owen's compass. She remembered buying it with Elena at an outdoor supply store, remembered her nephew's face lighting up when he'd opened it Christmas morning. He'd spent hours teaching himself to use it, insisting on checking their direction every time the family went hiking. "He kept it all these years," she said softly. "Through everything that happened, somehow he kept this." "Or the shepherd kept it," Agent Torres said. "This could be a trophy. Many serial predators keep items from their victims." But Caroline shook her head. "No. Owen loved this compass. If he adapted the way the journal suggested, if he became what the shepherd wanted, maybe keeping this was his way of holding on to who he used to be. A small act of resistance. Or it could be exactly what the shepherd wants you to think," Mark said firmly. "Caroline, this man is manipulating you. That's what he does. He sees what people need, hope, answers, closure, and he uses it against them." Caroline knew Mark was right. Everything about the shepherd's methods showed sophisticated psychological manipulation. The timing of his contacts, the information he chose to reveal, the way he was dangling Owen's survival in front of her like bait. It was all calculated. But knowing that didn't make it any less effective. Detective Holbrook ended her call. The package was dropped at a courier service location in Everett yesterday afternoon. Paid for in cash, sender gave a fake name and address. The clerk remembers a man in his 50s or 60s, described him as average height, gray hair, wearing outdoor clothing and a baseball cap. Very polite, very unremarkable. "Security footage?" Agent Torres asked. "They're pulling it now. But if he's been doing this as long as we think, he knows how to avoid cameras." Caroline looked at the photograph on her phone again. Then at the compass. 2 messages in less than 12 hours. The shepherd was escalating, becoming more bold. Why? He's worried, she said suddenly. The fire exposed his structure. We found Elena's journal. He knows we're building a case against him. He's trying to control the narrative, stay 1 step ahead. Agent Torres nodded slowly. That's a good observation. He's moving from passive monitoring to active engagement. That could mean he's feeling pressured, but it could also mean he's preparing for something. Like what? Like relocating, destroying evidence, or... Agent Torres hesitated. Or finishing what he started. If Owen really is alive and has been with him all these years, the shepherd might decide it's too risky to keep him now that we're closing in. The thought sent ice through Caroline's veins. We have to find him, before he hurts Owen or disappears completely. We're doing everything we can, Detective Holbrook assured her. We have teams reviewing the forum archives, analyzing the journal entries for geographic clues, and re-examining every missing persons case that matches the pattern. The FBI is coordinating with park services and forest rangers across the entire Pacific Northwest. If he has other structures out there, we'll find them. But Caroline heard the unspoken qualifier. We'll find them eventually, which might not be soon enough. I want to go back to the excavation site, she said. There might be something in the chambers we missed, something that only someone who knew Elena would recognize. Detective Holbrook exchanged a glance with Agent Torres. The site is still being processed. I know, but Elena left that journal knowing I'd find it. Maybe she left other messages, other clues meant specifically for me. It's possible, Agent Torres admitted. Family members sometimes notice details investigators overlook because they understand personal significance that wouldn't be obvious to strangers. Then let me try. Please. After a long moment, Detective Holbrook nodded. All right, but you go with an escort. You touch nothing without authorization, and if we tell you to leave, you leave immediately. Understood? Understood. They made plans to visit the site the following morning. After the detective and agent left, taking Owen's compass as evidence, Caroline sat with Mark in the kitchen. Are you sure about this? He asked quietly. Going back up there, potentially putting yourself in this man's sights. I'm already in his sights. He knows who I am, where I live. The question is what I do with that. You could let the professionals handle it. Let them do their job while you stay safe. Caroline took his hand. If it was our children, could you do that? Could you sit home and wait while someone else looked for them? Mark closed his eyes. No, I couldn't. But Caroline, our children need their mother. They've already lost their aunt and cousins. I can't... His voice broke. I can't lose you too. You won't. I promise I'll be careful. But I have to see this through. For Elena, for Sophie and David, and for Owen, if there's any chance he's still out there. That night, Caroline lay awake again, listening to the house settle around her. She thought about Owen at 8 years old, bright and curious, and so excited about his rock collection. She thought about what he might have become after 16 years with the shepherd, shaped and molded by captivity into something unrecognizable. Her phone buzzed. Another text from the same unknown number. This time it was a video file, just 10 seconds long. Caroline's hands shook as she pressed play. The footage showed a young man, the same one from the photograph, sitting at a rough wooden table in what looked like a cabin. He was carving something, his hands moving with practiced precision. The camera angle suggested whoever was filming was standing in a doorway, watching him. The young man looked up briefly, directly at the camera, before returning to his work. His expression was blank, almost serene. There was no fear in his eyes, no plea for help. Just empty acceptance. The video ended. Caroline called Detective Holbrook immediately, forwarding the file. Then she lay in the darkness, thinking about that empty look in the young man's eyes. Whether it was Owen or not, whoever he was had been broken completely. The shepherd had won with him, but Caroline was determined not to let him win permanently. Tomorrow she'd go back to those underground chambers. She'd search for whatever Elena had left behind. And somehow, she'd find a way to bring the shepherd into the light, even if it meant walking into the darkness to do it. The drive to Glacier Peak Wilderness the next morning felt different than it had days earlier. Caroline was accompanied by Detective Holbrook and a forensic specialist named Dr. Janet Reese, a woman in her 60s who specialized in archaeological crime scene analysis. They traveled in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what they might find. The excavation site had grown since Caroline's last visit. What had been a small team was now a full operation, with multiple tents set up for evidence processing, additional generators powering work lights into the underground chambers, and specialists from various agencies working in coordinated shifts. "We've mapped 6 of the 7 chambers your sister indicated in her journal," Dr. Reese explained as they approached the main entrance. "The 7th has been more challenging. It appears to be accessed through a flooded passage that's completely submerged. We're bringing in cave diving specialists tomorrow." Caroline felt a chill. Elena's final entries had mentioned hearing water rising. Had she drowned in that 7th chamber, alone in the dark? They descended into the structure using a more permanent ladder system that had been installed. The temperature dropped immediately, and Caroline's breath misted in the light from the work lamps. The earthen walls felt close, oppressive, and she had to consciously control her breathing to fight the claustrophobia. "We've documented and removed most of the physical evidence," Dr. Reese said, leading them through the narrow passage into what had been the main living chamber. "But I'd like you to look at everything we've photographed in situ. Sometimes family members notice significance in positioning or arrangement that we might miss." She pulled out a tablet showing hundreds of photographs. Caroline scrolled through images of the chamber as it had been found. The blankets still laid out, a makeshift shelf holding preserved food containers, a corner that appeared to have been designated for waste. One photograph made her stop. In the corner of the chamber, scratched into the earthen wall at child height, were tally marks, hundreds of them, organized in groups of 5. "How many?" Caroline asked, her voice barely audible. Dr. Reese checked her notes. 347 marks. If each represents a day, that's nearly a year. Caroline thought about Sophie making those marks, counting days in the darkness, holding onto some measure of time when everything else had been stripped away. The final mark was incomplete, just 4 scratches instead of 5, as if Sophie had made it in the morning and never returned to complete it. "There's something else I want to show you," Detective Holbrook said, leading Caroline to the chamber where they'd found Sophie's remains. The skeleton had been carefully removed, but the space still held evidence of the horror that had occurred here. "Look at the drawings," the detective said, pointing to the walls. Caroline had noticed them during her first visit, but she'd been too overwhelmed to study them closely. Now, with more stable lighting, she could see details that had been hidden in shadow. Mixed in with the crude symbols carved by the shepherd were different drawings, lighter, more delicate, clearly made by a child's hand. They weren't carved, but drawn in charcoal. Sophie had sketched birds, trees, mountains, and in one corner, barely visible, was a drawing of 4 stick figures holding hands. Below it, in careful lettering, "The Brennan family." Caroline's eyes filled with tears. She was trying to remember the outside world, the things she loved. She was also leaving messages, Dr. Reese said gently. "Look here." She pointed to a series of bird drawings arranged in a specific pattern on the opposite wall. "Do you notice anything about the order?" Caroline studied them. There was a robin, then an eagle, then a duck, then Redbone, she whispered, the first letters of each bird. Red-winged blackbird, eagle, duck, barn owl, owl, night heron, egret. Redbone was Sophie's middle name. Exactly. She signed her work, but in a way only someone who knew her would understand. Dr. Reese pulled up more photographs. There are other patterns. Here she drew 23 flowers. Your sister's birthday was the 23rd, correct? March 23rd, Caroline confirmed, amazed at her niece's resilience. Even in this nightmare, Sophie had found ways to maintain her identity, to communicate. "We believe she was trying to leave a record," Detective Holbrook said. "If she couldn't escape, she could at least ensure that someone would eventually know she'd been here, who she'd been." They spent another hour reviewing photographs, with Caroline identifying details that meant nothing to the investigators but everything to her. A series of scratches that marked Sophie's height at different times, showing how she'd grown during her captivity. A small alcove where Owen's treasured rocks had been carefully arranged, each one a specimen he'd collected before the abduction. But it was in the photographs of the deepest chamber that Caroline found something that stopped her cold. "Wait," she said, zooming in on an image of the carved symbols. "That's not random." Dr. Reese moved closer. "What do you see?" "These symbols, they're not just decoration. Elena taught mathematics. She used to create codes and puzzles for her students. Look at the pattern." Caroline traced the symbols with her finger on the screen. The shepherd carved his symbols in a circular pattern, but there are small marks within some of them. Tiny scratches that could be natural damage, except they're too regular. She grabbed a piece of paper and started copying down the marks, translating them based on a code she and Elena had invented as children. A simple substitution cipher they'd used to pass notes. The letters emerged slowly. "Sanctuary North 3 miles, Old Mine." "She found out where he took Owen," Caroline breathed. "The sanctuary he mentioned in the journal. It's 3 miles north, at an old mine." Detective Holbrook immediately radioed her team. "We need topographical maps of the area. Identify any old mining operations within a 5-mile radius." Within 20 minutes, they had an answer. There were 3 abandoned mine sites in the area, all dating back to the early 1900s, when copper mining had briefly flourished in the region. The closest was 2.8 miles north-northwest of the current location, close enough to match Elena's message. "We need to search that site," Agent Torres said over the radio. He'd been coordinating operations from the command tent above ground. "But carefully. If the shepherd is still using it, we don't want to tip him off." Caroline looked at Detective Holbrook. "I need to come with you." "Absolutely not. If this is an active site." "Elena left me that message specifically. She knew I'd find it because she knew how I think, knew the code we shared. Maybe there are other messages there, other things only I would recognize." The detective hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and practicality. "If you come, you stay back. You don't approach the site until we've cleared it. Agreed?" "Agreed." They assembled a team, 6 officers, Agent Torres, Detective Holbrook, and Caroline. The hike to the mine took nearly 2 hours, following old logging roads that had long since been reclaimed by forest. The landscape here showed less fire damage, with thick canopy blocking out most of the midday sun. The mine entrance was concealed behind a rock fall that looked natural but, upon closer inspection, showed signs of deliberate arrangement. Someone had carefully positioned boulders to hide the opening while still allowing access through a narrow gap. Agent Torres organized the team into tactical positions while 2 officers equipped with cameras and weapons prepared to enter. Caroline waited with Detective Holbrook behind a fallen log, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The officers disappeared into the darkness. Long minutes passed. Then one of them emerged, his face pale in the dim forest light. "You need to see this," he said. They approached carefully, squeezing through the gap in the rocks. The mine entrance opened into a larger tunnel, reinforced with old timber supports. Modern LED lanterns had been strung along the walls, leading deeper into the earth. The tunnel branched into multiple passages, but the main route was marked with painted symbols on the walls, the same symbols the shepherd had carved in the other structure. They followed these deeper, the air growing colder and more stale. Finally, they emerged into a large chamber that made the underground structure at Whispering Creek look primitive by comparison. This was the shepherd's true sanctuary. The space had been outfitted almost like a real home. There were solar panels visible through a cleverly disguised vent to the surface, providing power to lights, a small refrigerator, even a computer setup. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books, supplies, and dozens of journals. But what dominated the room was the wall of photographs. Hundreds of images, carefully arranged and labeled. Solo hikers, families, couples, all in wilderness settings, most appearing to be candid shots taken from a distance. Below each photograph was a notation, dates, locations, and, in some cases, a red X. Caroline moved closer, scanning the faces. There was Rebecca Marsh, the solo hiker from 1995, a family of 3 from 1998, 2 young women from 2001, all marked with red X's. And there, in the center, were photographs of the Brennan family. Multiple shots from their camping trip. David setting up the tent, Elena helping Sophie with her camera, Owen examining rocks. The photos had been taken from the tree line, the subjects unaware they were being watched. "He stalked them," Caroline whispered. "For how long?" Agent Torres was examining a desk in the corner. "There are files here, detailed files on each victim." He opened a folder labeled Brennan Family. July 1997. Inside were pages of handwritten notes documenting David and Elena's work schedules, the children's school activities, their home address, even Elena's posts on the hiking forum. The shepherd had been watching the family for months before the abduction, learning everything about them. Detective Holbrook found something else, a map on the wall showing the Cascade Mountain Range with multiple locations marked. There are at least 8 other sites indicated here. If each one is a structure like the others, he could have dozens of victims, Agent Torres finished grimly. Caroline was drawn to a newer section of the wall where more recent photographs were displayed. And there he was, the young man from the texted photograph, shown in various poses around what appeared to be this very chamber, cooking at a small stove, reading from one of the journals, sitting at the computer. The most recent photo was dated September 20th, 2013, 3 days ago. The young man was standing at the mine entrance, looking out at the forest with that same hollow expression. "Owen," Caroline breathed. "He's real. He's alive." But there was something else in the photograph that made her stomach turn. Visible in the background, partially hidden in shadow, was another figure. Older, watching Owen with an expression of satisfaction. The shepherd, finally caught on camera in his own lair. "We need forensics here immediately," Agent Torres said, already on his radio. "This is a treasure trove of evidence. If we can identify him from these photos, track the computer activity." A sound from deeper in the mine made everyone freeze. Footsteps. Someone was approaching from one of the side passages. The officers immediately took defensive positions, weapons drawn. "Federal agents, come out with your hands visible." The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then a voice, young and uncertain, called out, "Are you here to take me away?" Caroline's breath caught. That voice, it sounded like David, like her brother-in-law. "We're with the FBI," Agent Torres called back. "Come out slowly with your hands up. We're not going to hurt you." A figure emerged from the shadows. The young man from the photographs, thin and pale, with dark hair hanging in his eyes. He was wearing worn outdoor clothing and held his hands above his head, but there was no fear in his expression. Just empty curiosity. "Are you Owen Brennan?" Detective Holbrook asked carefully. The young man tilted his head, considering the question. "I was once, a long time ago." Caroline stepped forward despite the detective's restraining hand. "Owen, I'm your Aunt Caroline, your mom's sister. Do you remember me?" Those hollow eyes focused on her, and for just a moment, something flickered in their depths. Recognition, hope, but it was gone so quickly Caroline might have imagined it. "Aunt Caroline," he said slowly, as if testing out the words. "You used to bring me books about rocks, geology books. Tears streamed down Caroline's face. Yes, I did. You loved those books. I still have some of them. The shepherd let me keep them. Owen lowered his hand slightly. Is he dead? Is that why you're here? Who's dead? Agent Torres asked sharply. The shepherd? He said if I ever saw strangers in the sanctuary, it would mean he was dead and I should go with them, that the old world would claim me again. Owen spoke calmly, reciting information he'd clearly been told many times. I'm supposed to forget everything he taught me and become weak again. Where is he? Detective Holbrook demanded. Where is the shepherd? Owen pointed toward one of the side passages. The deep chambers. He goes there when he needs to think, but he doesn't like to be disturbed. 3 officers moved immediately toward the passage Owen had indicated, while 2 others stayed with the young man. Caroline watched her nephew, because despite 16 years and unimaginable trauma, this was Owen. Stand completely still, showing no emotion at being surrounded by armed law enforcement. Owen, she said gently, you're safe now. We're going to take you somewhere safe, get you medical attention. I don't need medical attention. The shepherd taught me how to stay healthy, how to survive. He spoke with eerie detachment, like someone reciting a lesson. He said the weak die and the strong adapt. I adapted. Before Caroline could respond, shouts came from the passage. The officers had found something. Agent Torres rushed toward the sound, followed by Detective Holbrook. Caroline stayed with Owen, studying her nephew's face for any sign of the boy she'd known. Do you remember your family? Your mom and dad? Sophie? Sophie died because she wouldn't adapt, Owen said matter-of-factly. Dad died because he fought against necessary discipline. Mom died because she got sick and refused the shepherd's medicine. The casual way he discussed his family's deaths sent chills through Caroline. Owen, they didn't die because they were weak. They died because someone hurt them, someone evil. The shepherd isn't evil. He's enlightened. He understands what the wilderness teaches. Owen's voice remained flat, emotionless. You don't understand yet, but you will. Agent Torres returned, his face grim. We found him. The shepherd. He's dead. Looks like he's been dead for at least 48 hours. Appears to be self-inflicted gunshot wound. Caroline felt the world tilt. What? There's a note. It's addressed to you, Ms. Mercer. The agent handed her a plastic evidence bag containing a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was the same neat script from the note attached to Owen's compass. Caroline Mercer, you wanted answers. Now you have them. The wilderness will claim us all eventually, one way or another. Some go fighting, some go peacefully. I chose my own moment, my own way. Owen is my legacy, my proof that humans can evolve beyond their civilized weakness. He survived when his family couldn't. He became what they refused to become. Study him, learn from him, or let him go and watch him die in your soft world. Either way, I've won. The shepherd. Caroline looked at Owen, who was watching her with those empty eyes. The shepherd had killed himself, but not before leaving one final victim. A young man so broken and reshaped that he no longer knew who he'd been meant to be. We need to get him out of here, Detective Holbrook said quietly. Get him to a hospital, start the psychological evaluation process. But as officers moved to escort Owen toward the exit, he spoke again. There are others, you know, in the deep chambers. He kept them separate so they couldn't contaminate each other's adaptation. Everyone froze. What others? Agent Torres demanded. Owen smiled for the first time, a strange, unsettling expression. The ones who are still learning, the ones who haven't adapted yet. Would you like to meet them? The mine's deep chambers extended far beyond what the initial survey had suggested. Owen led the team through a maze of passages with the confidence of someone who'd walked these routes countless times. Officers flanked him on both sides, but he showed no awareness of being guarded or any inclination to flee. How many others? Agent Torres asked as they descended deeper into the earth. Owen considered the question. 3 that are still alive. Maybe 4. The shepherd stopped bringing new students after the fire exposed his first teaching site. He said it was too risky, that we needed to perfect the ones already chosen. The casual reference to human beings as students made Caroline's skin crawl. She followed behind the main group, with Detective Holbrook staying close beside her. "You shouldn't be seeing this," the detective whispered. "Whatever we find down here, I need to," Caroline interrupted. "If there are survivors, if there are families still waiting for answers like I was, I need to bear witness." The passage opened into a larger chamber similar to the one where they'd found the shepherd's body. But this space had been divided into separate cells, each sealed with a heavy wooden door reinforced with metal bars. There were 5 doors total, 3 of which had padlocks securing them. "They're in there," Owen said, pointing to the locked doors. "The shepherd kept them separated. He said isolation accelerates adaptation. The ones who can endure solitude become stronger." Agent Torres approached the first door, which had a small window cut into the wood at eye level. He peered through, then stepped back quickly, his expression shocked. "There's someone in there. Young woman, appears to be in her 20s. She's alive but unresponsive." He moved to the next door. "This one has a man, older, maybe 30s. Same condition. Alive but catatonic." The third door revealed another young woman, but unlike the others, this one reacted to the window opening. She rushed forward, pressing her face against the bars, her eyes wild. "Please," she gasped, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Please get me out. He's dead, isn't he? I heard the gunshot days ago. He's dead and you found us, please." "Stand back from the door," Agent Torres said gently. "We're going to get you out. Just step back so we can work the lock." The woman retreated, and officers began working on the padlock. While they did, Caroline approached Owen. "How long have they been here, these people?" "Time moves differently down here," Owen replied, that eerie detachment still present. The shepherd said measuring time was a civilized weakness, but the woman who speaks, she's been here the shortest. 2 winters, maybe 3. 2 or 3 years? Caroline felt sick. "And the others?" "Longer. The man has been learning for 5 winters, the silent woman for 7. Owen watched the officers work with mild interest, as if this was all academic. "They haven't adapted as well as I did. The shepherd said some people are too broken by their old lives to accept new truth." The first lock gave way, and officers cautiously entered the cell. The young woman who'd spoken collapsed into their arms, sobbing and incoherent. Medics who'd been called to the scene rushed forward with blankets and water. As they brought her out into the larger chamber, Caroline got a better look. The woman was emaciated, her clothes hanging off her frame, her hair matted and filthy. But she was alive and conscious, and despite her obvious trauma, there was still light in her eyes. Still fight. "What's your name?" one of the medics asked gently. Sarah Chen. I'm from Portland. I went hiking in 2010, and there was a man. He seemed lost. I tried to help." Her words tumbled over each other, 3 years of silence breaking free. "He took me, drugged me. When I woke up, I was here, and he said I needed to learn to be worthy of survival, needed to prove I could endure." "You're safe now," the medic assured her. "You're going to be okay." They worked on the second lock while Caroline watched Sarah being tended to. 3 years in isolation, enduring whatever psychological torture the shepherd had devised. And yet she'd survived with her sense of self intact, refusing to adapt the way Owen had. The second door opened to reveal a man in his 30s, sitting cross-legged in the corner of his cell, staring at nothing. Unlike Sarah, he showed no reaction to the officers entering. They had to physically lift him to his feet and guide him out. "What's your name?" Detective Holbrook asked him gently. No response. The man's eyes tracked movement, but showed no comprehension, no recognition that anything had changed. "He's been like that for 2 years," Owen offered helpfully. The shepherd said his mind retreated into itself. A defensive mechanism, but ultimately a failure of adaptation. The strong mind learns to find peace in isolation, not escape from it. Caroline wanted to shake her nephew, to scream that these weren't lessons but atrocities. But she could see that Owen genuinely believed what he was saying. The shepherd had so thoroughly reconstructed his worldview that Owen saw nothing wrong with any of this. The third cell held another young woman, curled in a fetal position on a thin mattress. She didn't move when the door opened, didn't respond to voices or gentle touches. Like the man, she seemed to have retreated entirely into herself. "Her name is Melissa," Owen said. "She stopped speaking 4 years ago. The shepherd tried many teaching methods with her, but she was too weak. He kept her anyway, said she served as an example of what happens when you resist the wilderness's truth." While medics worked to assess the catatonic victims, Agent Torres examined the remaining 2 doors, which stood unlocked and empty. What happened to whoever was in these cells? Owen's expression didn't change. "They died." The shepherd said death is also a form of adaptation, returning your elements to the earth, becoming part of the wilderness cycle. "How did they die?" Caroline forced herself to ask. "Different ways. One stopped eating. The shepherd let her make that choice, said it taught the rest of us about weakness. The other got sick like my mother did. Infection from a cut that wouldn't heal." Owen spoke with the same detachment he'd shown discussing his own family's deaths. "The shepherd performed the burial rituals himself, returned their bodies to the forest." "Where?" Agent Torres demanded. "Where are the bodies?" "I can show you. There's a place in the forest where the shepherd kept the teaching graves. He said we should visit them sometimes, to remember what happens to those who don't adapt." The casual horror of it, the shepherd creating a cemetery for his victims, using their deaths as object lessons, was almost incomprehensible. Caroline found herself leaning against the stone wall, trying to process everything. Detective Holbrook approached her. "Ms. Mercer, you should go back to the surface. Let us handle the rest of this." "I can't leave Owen," Caroline said. "He's my nephew, my responsibility. He's also potentially a material witness to multiple homicides, and possibly an accomplice. We don't know yet what role he played in all this." Caroline looked at Owen, who was calmly watching the medics work. He was 8 years old when this started. Whatever he became, it wasn't his choice. Maybe not, but that's for mental health professionals to determine. Right now, we need to focus on securing this scene and getting the survivors medical attention. Over the next hour, the mine became a hive of coordinated activity. Sarah Chen was stabilized and transported to the nearest hospital. The 2 catatonic victims were carefully evacuated with medical support. Owen cooperated with everything, answering questions in his eerily calm manner, showing agents where the shepherd kept supplies, documentation, and other evidence. Caroline stayed in the background, observing her nephew with a breaking heart. Sometimes he would make a gesture or tilt his head in a way that reminded her painfully of David, but mostly he seemed like a stranger, someone wearing Owen Brennan's face, while being fundamentally different underneath. Agent Torres approached her as the sun was beginning to set. "We're going to need to take Owen into protective custody. He needs comprehensive psychiatric evaluation, and we need to determine the full extent of his involvement with the shepherd's activities. You can't think he's responsible for any of this. He was a child when he was taken. I don't think he's criminally culpable, but we need to understand what happened to him. And Ms. Mercer, you should prepare yourself for the possibility that Owen may never fully recover from this. The psychological damage from 16 years of this kind of manipulation, it might be permanent." Caroline watched Owen demonstrate to an officer how the shepherd had rigged a pulley system for moving supplies through the mine. He was helpful, articulate, completely devoid of normal emotional responses. "Can I talk to him?" she asked. "Before you take him?" Agent Torres considered, then nodded. 5 minutes, and one of my people stays within earshot." Caroline approached Owen, who was examining some of the journals the shepherd had kept. "Owen, can we talk?" He looked up, that hollow gaze settling on her. "Of course, Aunt Caroline." They sat on a bench carved from stone near the main chamber entrance. An officer positioned himself a respectful distance away, but clearly listening. "Do you remember your life before?" Caroline asked. "Before the shepherd took you?" Owen thought about this. "I remember pieces, like photographs in a book. I remember a house with blue shutters, a dog named Rocket, someone reading to me at bedtime." He paused. "But those memories feel like they belong to someone else, a different person who doesn't exist anymore. That person was you, Owen. That was who you were supposed to be. The shepherd said our old selves were weak, corrupted by civilization. He said I had potential because I was young enough to be reformed, to learn the truth about survival before the lies became permanent." Owen picked up one of the journals, running his fingers over the cover. "He wasn't cruel. He was teaching us. He cared about our development. He imprisoned you. He killed your family. He freed us from the weakness that would have destroyed us eventually. Dad was too proud, too attached to his civilized identity. Sophie was too emotional, couldn't control her fear. Mom was too soft, couldn't accept necessary hardship." Owen spoke as if reciting a catechism. "I survived because I was willing to become something better." Caroline felt tears streaming down her face. "Oh, Owen, what did he do to you?" For the first time, a crack appeared in Owen's facade. His hand tightened on the journal, and his voice wavered slightly. "He made me forget how to be afraid, how to hope, how to want anything except survival. And now," he looked at her with something that might have been confusion or might have been pain. "Now you're telling me that was wrong, that everything I learned, everything I became, was built on lies. But if that's true, then what am I? If I'm not who the shepherd made me, and I can't be who I was before, then what's left?" Caroline reached for his hand, but he pulled away. The brief moment of vulnerability was gone, replaced again by that empty calm. "The officers are going to take me somewhere," he said, standing. "Probably a hospital or facility where they'll try to fix me. But you can't fix what isn't broken. I adapted. I survived. That's what matters." "Owen, thank you for looking for us, Aunt Caroline, for not forgetting. Mom would have appreciated that." He turned to Agent Torres. "I'm ready to go now. I've shown you everything I know." As officers led Owen toward the mine entrance, Caroline sat on the stone bench and wept. She'd spent 16 years searching for her sister's family. She'd found them, or what was left of them. David dead in a collapsed tunnel. Sophie's small skeleton in a chamber of horrors. Elena expired from illness in the dark. And Owen, alive but so fundamentally damaged that the boy he'd been might as well be dead too. Detective Holbrook sat beside her, saying nothing, just offering silent support as Caroline grieved for all the deaths, both physical and psychological, that had occurred in these mountains. Eventually, Caroline's tears subsided. She wiped her face and looked at the detective. "What happens now? Now we document everything. We identify all the victims. We notify families. We try to understand the full scope of what the shepherd did over the years." Detective Holbrook paused. "And we try to help the survivors, including Owen, though that's going to be a long process. Can I see him, visit him while he's in treatment?" "That will be up to the psychiatrists. They'll need to determine what's best for his recovery." The detective's expression softened. "Ms. Mercer, I know this isn't the reunion you hoped for, but he is alive. That's something." Caroline nodded, though she wasn't sure she agreed. The Owen being loaded into a transport vehicle wasn't her nephew, not really. He was something else entirely, a monument to one man's twisted ideology and decades of psychological manipulation. As they emerged from the mine into the twilight forest, Caroline took one last look at the entrance. Somewhere in there, the shepherd's body lay in the darkness he'd chosen. He'd escaped justice in life, but his legacy would be thoroughly documented. Every victim identified, every crime catalogued. His name, when they finally discovered it, would be forever associated with horror. Small comfort, but it was something. Caroline's phone buzzed with a message from Mark. "I saw the news. Are you okay? Kids are worried. Come home." Home. The word felt foreign after everything she'd seen. How could she go home and resume normal life knowing what she now knew? How could she kiss her children goodnight without thinking of Sophie scratching tally marks on a wall? How could she sleep without seeing Owen's hollow eyes? But she had to try. She had a family that needed her, a life that existed outside this nightmare. As she walked toward the cars that would take them back to civilization, Caroline made a silent promise to Elena. She would make sure Owen got the best possible care. She would ensure that all the Shepherd's victims were identified and their families notified. She would bear witness to what had happened here so that none of them would be forgotten. The wilderness had taken so much, but it had also given up its secrets. Now it was up to the living to ensure those secrets led to justice, healing, and remembrance. Even if true healing seemed impossibly far away, the media descended on the Glacier Peak case within 48 hours of the discoveries. What had been a 16-year-old cold case suddenly became the lead story on every news outlet. Caroline found herself besieged by reporters, camera crews camping outside her house, and endless requests for interviews. She declined them all. Instead, she spent her days at the FBI field office in Seattle, working with Agent Torres and his team to identify the Shepherd and catalog his victims. The man's true identity had proven surprisingly elusive. He'd left no fingerprints on file, no DNA matches in any database, and the photographs found in the mine showed a man who seemed to have deliberately kept his face partially obscured in most images, always wearing a hat, always photographed from angles that made clear identification difficult. He was careful, Agent Torres explained during one of their daily briefings. Everything about his methodology suggests decades of planning and experience. The underground structures took years to build. The psychological manipulation techniques show sophisticated understanding of trauma bonding and learned helplessness. This wasn't someone who suddenly snapped. This was someone who'd been perfecting his approach for a very long time. They were in a conference room that had been converted into a command center for the investigation. One wall was covered with photographs of confirmed and potential victims. Another held maps showing the locations of the Shepherd's various sites throughout the Cascade Range. A third displayed evidence collected from the mine, journals, photographs, the detailed files he'd kept on each victim. Caroline had read portions of those files. They were clinical, detached, documenting each captive's progress toward what the Shepherd called adaptation. He'd rated them on various criteria: resilience, compliance, ability to endure isolation, acceptance of his teachings. Owen had been rated highest in nearly every category, with notes praising his exceptional malleability and complete psychological reformation. Reading those notes about her nephew felt like a violation, seeing him reduced to data points in a madman's experiment. "We've made progress on identifying him through other means," Detective Holbrook said, pulling up information on a laptop. "We tracked purchases of construction materials to remote locations over the past 20 years. Someone was buying significant quantities of timber, hardware, solar panels, all paid for in cash at different suppliers, but there's a pattern." She brought up a grainy photograph from a security camera at a lumber yard in Wenatchee, dated 2003. The image showed a man in his 50s loading timber into a pickup truck. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and had his face turned away from the camera, but his build and posture matched the partial images from the mine. "We cross-referenced this with sales records and found something interesting," Detective Holbrook continued. "The truck visible in this image has a partial plate number. We ran variations and found a vehicle registered to a property in rural Skagit County under the name Thomas Whitmore." Caroline's pulse quickened. "Do you think that's him?" "We're investigating the property now, but here's what makes it compelling. Thomas Whitmore doesn't exist in any records before 1990. No birth certificate, no school records, no employment history prior to that year. It appears to be an assumed identity." "So who was he before 1990? Caroline asked. Agent Torres pulled up another file. We're working on that. We've sent his DNA, collected from the mine, to genealogy databases. We're hoping for a familial match that might tell us his real identity. We're also analyzing his journals for any personal details he might have let slip. Caroline had spent hours reading those journals herself. They were filled with philosophical ramblings about wilderness survival, the corruption of modern civilization, and the shepherd's belief that he was performing a necessary service by preparing people for what he saw as society's inevitable collapse. But personal details were scarce. He referred to himself only as the shepherd, and wrote as if he'd sprung fully formed into his role, with no past before his mission began. There were hints, though. References to the failures of my first teaching suggested there had been earlier victims, possibly before he'd perfected his methods. Mentions of my own transformation in the wild implied he'd undergone some kind of personal trial that had shaped his ideology. And one particularly cryptic passage read, "The man I was died in these mountains 30 years ago. The shepherd was born from his ashes." If that was literal, it suggested the shepherd had experienced some kind of crisis or trauma in the wilderness in the early 1980s. Something that had fundamentally altered him. "What about the teaching graves?" Caroline asked. "Has Owen shown you where they are?" Detective Holbrook's expression grew somber. "He has. We've located and exhumed 7 bodies so far, all in various stages of decomposition, all buried in shallow graves throughout the area. Owen was very helpful, described each burial in detail with no apparent emotional response." Caroline's stomach turned. 7 more victims. At least 7. Owen indicated there might be more he wasn't aware of, people the shepherd dealt with before Owen arrived, or in locations Owen wasn't taken to. Agent Torres pulled up photos of items recovered from the graves. "We're working on identifying the remains through DNA, dental records, and personal effects found with the bodies." One photograph showed a woman's driver's license, preserved in a plastic bag and buried with its owner. Rebecca Marsh, the solo hiker who disappeared in 1995, the one whose case Caroline had found in the Forum archives. "How many people do you think he took over the years?" Caroline asked quietly. "We're still determining that, but based on the evidence we've found, the patterns in missing persons cases, and the scope of his operation..." Agent Torres paused. "We're looking at potentially 30 to 40 victims over approximately 25 years. The number was staggering. 30 to 40 people, stolen from their lives, subjected to captivity and psychological torture, most of them dead and buried in unmarked graves. And the world had never known because the shepherd had chosen his victims carefully, often solo hikers or small groups whose disappearances could be attributed to natural wilderness dangers." "What about the survivors?" Caroline asked. "How are they doing?" "Sarah Chen is recovering physically at a hospital in Seattle. Psychologically, she has a long road ahead, but she's communicating, cooperating with therapists, and her family has been notified. They're flying in from Portland today." Detective Holbrook pulled up another file. "The 2 catatonic victims are more concerning. The man, who we've identified as Marcus Webb, missing since 2008, shows minimal responsiveness to stimuli. Doctors say it's possible he'll emerge from his dissociative state with proper treatment, but it could take months or years. The woman, Melissa Hartley, missing since 2006, is showing similar symptoms. Her prognosis is uncertain. And Owen." There was a heavy pause. Agent Torres exchanged a look with Detective Holbrook before answering. "Owen is at a secure psychiatric facility in Western Washington. He's compliant with evaluation, answers questions thoroughly, but shows what doctors describe as profound emotional blunting. He doesn't seem to understand why he's being held or what he's being treated for. From his perspective, he's perfectly healthy. He adapted, survived, became what the shepherd intended." "Can I see him?" Caroline had asked this question multiple times over the past 2 days. The psychiatric team needs more time to complete their initial assessment. They're concerned that visits from family might be destabilizing at this stage. He needs to establish a baseline relationship with his treatment providers before introducing complex emotional connections. Agent Torres's voice softened. I know that's not what you want to hear, but these doctors are specialists in severe trauma and captivity cases. They know what they're doing. Caroline nodded, though frustration burned in her chest. She'd spent 16 years searching for Owen, and now that she'd found him, she couldn't even speak to him. A knock on the conference room door interrupted them. A young analyst entered carrying a laptop. Agent Torres, the genealogy results came back. We have a familial match. Everyone straightened. The analyst set up the laptop, pulling up a family tree diagram. The DNA from the shepherd matches someone in the database at a level suggesting first cousins. The match is to a woman named Patricia Hendricks, who submitted her DNA 2 years ago trying to trace her family history. Where is Patricia Hendricks? Agent Torres asked. Spokane. We've already made contact. She's willing to talk to us. Within 3 hours, Caroline found herself sitting in on a video call with Patricia Hendricks, a woman in her early 60s with graying hair and a cautious expression. I don't understand why the FBI is asking about my family tree, Patricia said, clearly nervous. We're trying to identify someone whose DNA indicates he's related to you as a first cousin, Agent Torres explained carefully. This person is connected to a serious criminal investigation. Any information you can provide about your extended family would be extremely helpful. Patricia's eyes widened. Criminal investigation? What kind of... She stopped herself. All right. What do you need to know? Can you tell us about your father's siblings or your mother's siblings? My mother was an only child. My father had 2 brothers, Lawrence and Henry. Lawrence died in Vietnam in 1968. Henry... She paused, her expression troubled. Henry disappeared in 1982. My family assumed he died in the wilderness. He was always obsessed with mountain climbing, survival challenges, that sort of thing. Caroline leaned forward. What was Henry's full name? Henry James Whitmore. He was a teacher, actually. Taught high school biology and environmental science in Everett. Patricia pulled out her phone, scrolling through photos. I have a picture of him somewhere. This was from the late 70s. She held up the phone to the camera. The photograph showed a man in his 30s, lean and intense-looking, standing on a mountain trail. He had the same basic build and features as the partial images they'd found in the mine. What happened when he disappeared? Detective Holbrook asked. Henry had always talked about testing himself against nature, proving he could survive with primitive tools and knowledge. In 1982, he told our family he was going on an extended solo trip into the North Cascades. He planned to spend several months living off the land, experiencing what he called authentic human existence. Patricia's voice grew sad. He never came back. Search teams looked for him but found nothing. After a while, we assumed he died out there, fell, got sick, something. It was hard for my father. They'd already lost Lawrence, and then Henry. Did Henry have any history of mental illness? Unusual behaviors? Agent Torres pressed. Patricia hesitated. He was intense, obsessive about his ideas regarding self-sufficiency and wilderness survival. He'd argue with people about how civilization was making humans weak, how we needed to return to more primitive ways of living. Some family members thought he was just passionate about his beliefs. Others worried there was something more concerning going on. She paused. After he disappeared, my aunt found journals in his apartment. Disturbing stuff about purging weakness, testing worthiness, things that made her uncomfortable. She destroyed them rather than let anyone else see. Said it was better to remember Henry as he was, not as whatever he was becoming. The pieces fell into place. Henry James Whitmore had gone into the mountains in 1982, supposedly to test himself. But instead of dying or returning, he'd undergone some kind of transformation. The man I was died in these mountains 30 years ago. The shepherd was born from his ashes. He'd created a new identity, Thomas Whitmore, probably using his own surname but a different first name. He'd started building his underground structures, developing his methodology, and selecting victims. "Ms. Hendricks," Caroline said, her voice tight with emotion, "your cousin didn't die in the wilderness. He stayed there. And over the past 30 years, he kidnapped and murdered dozens of people, including my sister and her family." Patricia's face went white. "Oh my God. Henry, he was the one all over the news? The Cascade Shepherd?" "Yes, and we need to know everything you remember about him. Anything that might help us understand why he did this, or if there might be other locations he used." For the next 2 hours, Patricia shared everything she could remember about Henry Whitmore. His childhood fascination with wilderness survival, his college thesis on primitive human societies, his increasingly radical views about modern civilization, his identification with indigenous peoples' pre-contact lifestyles, his belief that most humans were corrupted beyond redemption, but that a few might be saved through proper teaching. She also provided photographs, documents, and the address of Henry's last known residence, an apartment in Everett that had long since been rented to others but might still yield evidence. When the call ended, Caroline sat back in her chair, exhausted. They had a name. Henry James Whitmore, born 1948, disappeared 1982, transformed into the shepherd. A high school teacher who'd taken his educational philosophy to its most horrific extreme, treating human beings as students in a deadly curriculum. "We'll notify the public tomorrow," Agent Torres said. "It'll help with identifying more victims if people can connect the name to someone they might have known or encountered." Caroline thought about Owen being raised by a former teacher, someone skilled in pedagogy and psychology. No wonder the shepherd had been so effective at reshaping an 8-year-old boy. He'd had professional training in how to influence young minds, and he'd twisted that knowledge toward evil purposes. "I need to tell Owen," Caroline said. "I need to tell him who the shepherd really was. Maybe knowing he was just a broken man with a fabricated philosophy, might help him start to break free from the indoctrination." "The doctors will determine the right time for that," Agent Torres replied. "But yes, eventually Owen needs to understand that the shepherd wasn't some enlightened guide. He was a mentally ill man who used his victims to act out his own trauma and delusions." As Caroline left the FBI office that evening, she felt a strange mixture of emotions. They'd identified the shepherd. They were finding his victims. The investigation was progressing exactly as it should. But Elena was still dead. Sophie was still dead. David was still dead. And Owen, while alive, might never fully recover. She drove home through Seattle's evening traffic, thinking about Henry Whitmore at 23, teaching high school students about ecosystems and adaptation. Had there been signs then of what he would become? Had students or colleagues noticed something off about him? Or had his transformation truly occurred in the wilderness? Some psychological break that turned an eccentric teacher into a serial predator? Mark was waiting when she got home, along with her children, 15-year-old Emma and 12-year-old James. They'd been shielded from the worst details, but knew their Aunt Elena's case had been solved, that their cousin Owen had been found. "Mom, is it true what they're saying on the news?" Emma asked. "About finding other people in the mountains?" Caroline sank onto the couch, suddenly exhausted. "Yes, honey, it's true. The man who took Aunt Elena's family had hurt a lot of people over many years." "Is Owen going to be okay?" James asked quietly. He'd been particularly affected by the news about his cousin, having been fascinated by the mystery his whole life. "I don't know yet. He's getting help from doctors who specialize in this kind of thing. We just have to hope that with time and treatment, he can heal." But even as she said it, Caroline remembered Owen's hollow eyes, his matter-of-fact descriptions of death and suffering, his complete lack of emotional response to being rescued. The doctors could try, but the damage might be too deep, too complete. That night, Caroline dreamed of the mine. In her dream, she walked through the passages, finding chamber after chamber filled with people, all the shepherd's victims, living and dead, watching her pass with accusing eyes. They didn't speak, but she heard their voices anyway, asking why it had taken 16 years to find them, why no one had come sooner. She woke gasping, her pillow damp with tears. Tomorrow they would announce the shepherd's identity. Tomorrow the world would know that a missing high school teacher from 1982 had become one of the Pacific Northwest's most prolific serial killers. Tomorrow more families would learn that their missing loved ones had been found, though not in the way anyone had hoped. But tonight, Caroline could only mourn. Mourn for Elena and her family. Mourn for all the shepherd's victims. And mourn for the boy Owen had been. Lost as surely as if he died in those mountains 30 years ago. The press conference announcing Henry James Whitmore's identity as the Cascade Shepherd drew national attention. Caroline watched from the FBI field office as Agent Torres and other officials revealed the scope of the investigation to a packed room of reporters. They displayed Whitmore's 1981 driver's license photo. A thin-faced man with intense eyes and dark hair already beginning to gray prematurely. They outlined his background as a high school teacher, his 1982 disappearance, and the evidence connecting him to at least 32 confirmed victims over 30 years. Within hours of the announcement, the FBI hotline was flooded with calls. Former students of Whitmore's called to describe his unusual teaching methods, his intense focus on survival skills, his increasingly strange lectures about human weakness. Hikers from the 90s and early 2000s reported encounters with a man matching his description who'd offered unsolicited advice about remote trails. And, most significantly, families of missing persons began making connections. Caroline was present when one such family was notified. The Kowalskis had lost their 20-year-old son Michael in 1999 when he'd gone on a solo backpacking trip and never returned. The young man's remains had been identified through DNA from one of the teaching graves Owen had led investigators to. She watched through a one-way mirror as Detective Holbrook sat with Michael's parents, now in their 60s, and gently explained that their son's disappearance hadn't been an accident, that he'd been taken, held captive, and eventually died in underground chambers built by a madman. Mrs. Kowalski's wail of grief echoed through the observation room, and Caroline felt it in her bones. This scene would play out dozens more times as victims were identified and families notified. Each one a fresh wound, each one a reminder that while the shepherd was dead, his victims' families would carry this pain forever. Over the following week, the investigation expanded to cover the full scope of Whitmore's crimes. Teams excavated all 8 sites marked on his map, finding evidence of occupation and, in several cases, additional remains. The total victim count climbed steadily, 32 confirmed dead, 3 survivors in addition to Owen, and at least 6 more missing persons cases being re-examined for potential connections. Caroline spent those days working with the FBI team, using her knowledge of Elena's case to help identify patterns in how Whitmore selected and approached victims. She noticed he'd evolved over time, starting with solo hikers in the early 90s, then escalating to couples in the mid-90s, and finally targeting families with children in the late 90s and early 2000s. Why the progression? She asked Agent Torres during one of their analytical sessions. Control, he replied. Solo victims were practice, helping him refine his methods. Couples gave him more complex psychological dynamics to manipulate, but families, especially families with children, gave him the ultimate power. He could use parental love as a weapon, force people to choose between compliance and their children's safety. Caroline thought about Elena's journal entries, the way she documented trying to protect Sophie and Owen, even as the shepherd systematically broke down their resistance. He enjoyed it. The psychological torture. It wasn't just about survival philosophy. He liked having that power. Most serial predators do. The ideology was probably partly genuine belief and partly justification for what he wanted to do anyway. By framing it as teaching and adaptation, He could tell himself he was helping them, not torturing them. On the 8th day after the mine discovery, Caroline was finally cleared to visit Owen. The psychiatric facility was a low-profile building in the woods outside Seattle, designed to look more like a retreat than a hospital. She met with Dr. Sarah Nakamura, the lead psychiatrist on Owen's case, before the visit. "I want you to understand what you're going to see," Dr. Nakamura said gently. They sat in her office, a peaceful space with large windows overlooking evergreen trees. "Owen's psychological state is unlike anything I've encountered in 30 years of practice. He shows symptoms consistent with complex PTSD, Stockholm Syndrome, and what we're calling identity replacement. His original personality structure was essentially overwritten by 16 years of intensive conditioning." "Can you reverse that?" Caroline asked. "Can you bring back who he was?" Dr. Nakamura's expression was compassionate but honest. "I don't know. The Owen Brennan who existed before 1997 may be irrecoverable. What we're working toward is helping the person he is now develop healthier thought patterns, form secure attachments, and build a new sense of self that isn't dependent on the shepherd's framework. It's not about restoring the past. It's about creating a viable future." The words were hard to hear, but Caroline appreciated the honesty. "How is he responding to treatment?" "He's compliant, intellectually engaged with therapy exercises, and physically healthy. But emotionally, he remains remarkably flat. He doesn't express fear, joy, anger, or sadness in normal ways. When we discuss his family's deaths, he shows the same affect as when we discuss the weather. It's as if those emotional pathways were completely severed." "The shepherd trained him not to feel," Caroline said quietly. "Exactly. And helping him reconnect with emotions is going to be the most challenging aspect of his recovery, because from his perspective, emotional detachment was survival. Caring about people got his family killed. Expressing vulnerability led to punishment. He learned to function without emotional connection, an unlearning that will require him to accept vulnerability again, something that terrifies most trauma survivors." Caroline was led through several security doors to a comfortable visiting room with soft furniture and warm lighting. Owen was already there, sitting on a couch, reading a book about geology. He looked up when she entered, and his expression shifted into what might have been a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Aunt Caroline, they said you'd be visiting today." "Hi, Owen." Caroline sat in a chair across from him, unsure how to begin. "How are you adjusting to being here?" "It's comfortable, climate-controlled, regular meals. The doctors ask a lot of questions." He set down his book, folding his hands in his lap in a posture that seemed unnaturally still. "They keep trying to get me to talk about my feelings, but I don't think I have the kind of feelings they're looking for." "What do you mean?" "They want me to say I'm angry at the shepherd, or sad about my family, or afraid of what happened to me. But I'm not. Those things occurred. I processed them according to what I learned about survival. Dwelling on them would serve no purpose." Caroline felt her heart break a little more. "Owen, it's okay to have feelings about what happened. It's normal, healthy even." The shepherd said normal and healthy were relative concepts defined by weak societies that couldn't survive real challenges. Owen's voice remained flat, reciting doctrine. He said emotional attachment made you vulnerable, made you easy to control, better to observe, adapt, and maintain psychological equilibrium. "The shepherd was wrong," Caroline said firmly. "He was a sick man named Henry Whitmore who twisted everything good about teaching and learning into something evil. He didn't enlighten you, he broke you. And I know that's hard to hear, but it's true." For a long moment, Owen just looked at her. Then something shifted in his expression. Not emotion exactly, but a kind of cognitive dissonance, like two contradictory thoughts fighting for dominance. "They told me his real name," Owen said finally. "Showed me his photograph from before. He looked different. Younger, almost normal. He was normal once. Then something happened to him in these mountains, and instead of getting help, he created this whole mythology to justify his deteriorating mental health. He seemed so certain about everything. The way the world worked, what humans needed to survive, why most people were doomed to extinction by their own weakness. Owen's hands tightened slightly on his knees, the first physical sign of distress Caroline had seen. If he was just crazy, if it was all delusion, then what was the point? What did we suffer for? There was no point. That's the terrible truth. Your family died for nothing. You lost 16 years of your life for nothing. All of it was just one mentally ill man's power fantasy, dressed up in philosophical language. Owen stood abruptly and walked to the window. He stared out at the trees, his back to Caroline. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. Sometimes at night, I remember things. Not big things, small ones. My mom singing while she made pancakes. My dad letting me help with his work, spreading out blueprints and explaining how buildings stayed standing. Sophie teaching me how to use her camera. He paused. Those memories hurt, so I pushed them away. It's easier to remember myself as who I became instead of who I was. Owen, Caroline started, but he continued. Dr. Nakamura says I'm avoiding grief, that I need to mourn my family, mourn my lost childhood, mourn the person I could have been, but I don't know how to do that. The shepherd taught me that grief was weakness, that clinging to the dead was inefficient. So when Sophie died, I didn't cry. When my mom died, I helped the shepherd bury her and then went back to my lessons. I survived by not caring, and now everyone wants me to care, but I don't know how anymore. Caroline went to him, standing beside him at the window. I think there's a part of you that does care. Otherwise, you wouldn't remember those small things. You wouldn't have kept your compass all these years. The fact that it hurts when you remember, that means something in you is still capable of feeling, even if the shepherd tried to destroy it. Owen was silent for a long time. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, he whispered, I miss them. I don't know how to miss them because I was taught not to, but I do. And I'm angry that they died. And I'm angry that I survived. And I'm angry that I don't know how to be anything except what he made me. Is that the kind of feeling the doctors want? Yes, Caroline said, tears streaming down her face. Yes, Owen, that's exactly it. For the first time since she'd found him, Owen's carefully controlled expression crumbled. He didn't cry. Caroline suspected he'd been conditioned too thoroughly against that. But his face contorted with something like pain, and his breathing became rapid and shallow. Dr. Nakamura appeared in the doorway almost immediately, clearly monitoring the session. She approached calmly, speaking in soothing tones. Owen, you're safe. This is a normal reaction to processing trauma. Can you sit down with me? Owen allowed himself to be guided back to the couch, where Dr. Nakamura talked him through breathing exercises. Caroline watched, feeling helpless but also hopeful. If Owen could access anger, loss, confusion, if he could feel anything beyond the flat acceptance the shepherd had instilled, then maybe there was a foundation to build on. After Owen had stabilized and been escorted back to his room by an orderly, Dr. Nakamura spoke with Caroline in the hallway. That was significant progress, the psychiatrist said. It's the first time he's expressed genuine emotion since arriving. You got through to him in a way we haven't been able to. What happens now? Caroline asked. Now we build on that breakthrough. Help him understand that feeling pain doesn't make him weak. It makes him human. It won't be quick, and there will be setbacks. But for the first time, I'm genuinely optimistic about his long-term prognosis. Caroline left the facility feeling cautiously hopeful, but also emotionally drained. The drive back to Seattle took her through forested mountain roads, and she found herself looking at the dense woods differently now. They'd always seemed peaceful to her, a place of recreation and natural beauty. But now she couldn't help but imagine what might be hidden in their depths. How many other predators might be using wilderness isolation to indulge their darkest impulses. When she got home, she found Mark and the kids had prepared dinner. They ate together as a family, talking about normal things, Emma's upcoming school play, James's science project, Mark's latest work assignment. The mundane comfort of it helped ground Caroline back in the reality of her own life. Later, after the children were in bed, she sat with Mark on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "The FBI said they'll probably need me for another few weeks," Caroline told him, testifying when they prosecute anyone who might have helped Whitmore, consulting on victim identification, things like that. "Whatever you need to do," Mark said, taking her hand. "But Caroline, after that, I think you need to step back. Let the professionals finish the investigation. Focus on healing instead of on the case. Owen's recovery is going to take years. I need to be part of that." "I know, and you will be, but in the role of an aunt who loves him, not an investigator consumed by the case. There's a difference." Caroline knew he was right. She'd spent 16 years obsessed with finding Elena's family, and that single-minded focus had defined her life. Now that they'd been found, now that the shepherd's identity was known and his crimes documented, she needed to learn how to exist outside the investigation. "You're right," she said quietly. "I just don't know who I am if I'm not searching for them anymore." "You're a mother, a wife, a sister who never gave up, a woman who helped bring a monster to justice and survivors to safety. You're all of those things, Caroline. The search was part of your life, but it doesn't have to be all of it." They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands, while Caroline thought about the future. Owen's recovery, the other survivors' healing, the families of victims finding closure, and somehow, eventually, her own peace with everything that had happened. It wouldn't come quickly. The scars were too deep, the losses too profound. But for the first time in 16 years, Caroline felt like she could breathe without the weight of unanswered questions crushing her chest. The mystery was solved. The shepherd was dead. The truth, terrible as it was, had been brought to light. Now came the harder work of learning to live with that truth. 3 years later. Summer 2016. Caroline stood at the entrance to Glacier Peak Wilderness, watching the early morning light filter through the trees. The forest had recovered from the 2013 fire, new growth emerging green and vital among the blackened trunks. Life persisting, even in places scarred by devastation. Beside her stood Owen, now 27 years old. He was healthier than he'd been 3 years ago, had gained weight, his posture was less rigid, and there were moments when genuine expression crossed his face. He still struggled with emotional connection, still had days when he retreated into the flat effect the shepherd had instilled. But he was trying. That was what mattered. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Caroline asked him. Owen adjusted the backpack on his shoulders. A new one, not the kind the shepherd had used. "Dr. Nakamura thinks it's important, facing the place where it happened, reclaiming positive associations with the wilderness." They weren't alone. Dr. Nakamura was with them, along with a wilderness therapist named Marcus, who specialized in helping trauma survivors reconnect with environments associated with their abuse. Mark had wanted to come, but Caroline had gently declined. This needed to be just her and Owen, with their therapeutic support, taking back a piece of what had been stolen. The plan was modest. A short-day hike to a meadow Elena had written about in her forum posts before the 1997 trip. Not to the sites where the structures had been, which were still closed to the public as the investigation continued to process evidence. Just to a place Elena had wanted to show her children, a place that represented what wilderness was supposed to be: beautiful, peaceful, full of wonder rather than horror. They hiked in silence for the first mile, following a well-maintained trail through recovering forest. Owen moved with the unconscious skill of someone who'd spent years navigating wilderness, but he stayed close to Caroline, checking on her periodically in a way that suggested he was working on maintaining connections. "Tell me something about my mom," he said suddenly. "Something from before, when she was younger." Caroline smiled. This was something Owen had been doing more often lately, asking about his family, trying to build a picture of who they'd been beyond his fragmented childhood memories and the shepherd's distorted versions. When your mom was 12, she decided she was going to be a famous explorer. She made maps of our neighborhood, assigned scientific names to all the local cats, and kept detailed journals of her observations. Our parents thought it was a phase, but Elena stayed obsessed with documentation and discovery her whole life. Is that why she kept the journal in the chambers? Because she'd always documented things? I think so. Even in the worst circumstances, she stayed who she was. A documenter, a teacher, someone who believed in leaving a record. Caroline paused on the trail, turning to face her nephew. She would be so proud of how hard you're working to heal. You know that, right? Owen's expression did something complicated, a mixture of grief and gratitude that he was slowly learning to identify and tolerate. I hope so. Some days I feel like I'm betraying everything the shepherd taught me by choosing to feel things. Other days I realize that's exactly the point, that betraying his teaching is how I win. They continued upward, the trail climbing steadily. Dr. Nakamura and Marcus maintained a respectful distance, letting Caroline and Owen have their conversation while staying close enough to provide support if needed. The meadow, when they reached it, was exactly as Elena had described in her posts. A broad expanse of wildflowers nestled between mountain slopes, with a clear stream running through it and Mount Glacier Peak visible in the distance. It was breathtakingly beautiful, untouched by the fire, alive with bird song and the hum of insects. Owen stopped at the meadow's edge, his breathing slightly uneven. Caroline worried he was having a panic attack, but when she looked at his face, she realized he was crying. Silent tears rolling down his cheeks while he stared at the wildflowers. "Owen," she asked gently. "I remember this," he whispered. "Not this exact place, but we came to a meadow like this. Dad pointed out different flowers, made up silly names for them. Sophie took pictures. Mom spread out a blanket and we ate sandwiches." His voice cracked. I'd forgotten that memory. The shepherd made me forget happy things, said they were distractions from survival. But I remember now. Caroline put her arm around his shoulders, and for once, he didn't stiffen at the contact. They stood together, looking at the meadow, while Owen cried for the family he'd lost and the childhood that had been stolen. Dr. Nakamura approached quietly. "This is good, Owen. This is healing." They spent 2 hours in the meadow. Owen walked among the flowers, occasionally touching petals gently, as if relearning how to interact with beauty without the shepherd's dark philosophical framework. He sat by the stream and let the water run over his hands. He looked up at the mountains without seeing them as teaching tools or survival challenges, just as mountains, magnificent and indifferent. Before they left, Owen gathered a few small stones from the stream bed. "For my collection," he explained to Caroline. "I used to collect rocks. I want to start again." It was a small thing, but it felt monumental, a connection to who he'd been before. A choice to carry something forward that wasn't about survival or adaptation or the shepherd's teachings, just about a boy who'd once loved interesting stones. On the hike back down, Owen spoke more about his memories. Fragmentary, sometimes confused with things the shepherd had told him, but genuine. Caroline answered his questions, filled in details, helped him separate truth from the distorted narrative he'd been fed for 16 years. As they reached the trailhead, Owen paused. "Thank you for never giving up, for looking for us, even when everyone else had moved on." "I couldn't give up. You were family. You still are." "I'm not who I was," Owen said quietly. "I'm never going to be that 8-year-old boy again. Too much has changed. No one expects you to be. You're who you are now, someone who survived impossible circumstances and is choosing to heal. That's enough, Owen. It's more than enough." They drove back to Seattle, where Owen was living in a supervised group home for trauma survivors while continuing his intensive therapy. He had a job at a geological survey office, working with rock and soil samples, something that connected to his childhood interest but didn't require complex social interactions he still struggled with. He had a routine, a support system, and a slowly expanding capacity for human connection. Was he healed? No. Would he ever be fully healed? Probably not. But he was alive, and he was trying, and some days that felt like a miracle. Caroline continued her own therapy, processing her complicated grief over Elena and the family she'd lost. She'd become an advocate for missing persons, families, using her experience to help others navigate the nightmare of having a loved one disappear. She gave talks at law enforcement conferences about the importance of persistent investigation and family involvement. She'd even written a book about Elena's case, with all proceeds going to wilderness safety education. The FBI's investigation into Henry Whitmore's crimes had officially closed the previous year. Final victim count: 34 confirmed dead. 5 survivors, including Owen. 8 underground structures throughout the Cascade Range, all now destroyed. Hundreds of hours of journals and videos cataloged, providing insight into the mind of a man who transformed personal trauma into systemic evil. Several of Whitmore's former students had come forward with memories of concerning behavior. His intense focus on weeding out weakness, his contempt for students he deemed too soft or emotional, his belief that modern education was failing to prepare young people for survival. There had been complaints, but nothing concrete enough for action. He'd been considered eccentric but harmless, until he'd walked into the mountains in 1982 and decided never to come back. Caroline thought about that sometimes. How different things might have been if someone had intervened earlier, if Whitmore had received proper mental health treatment, if his increasingly dangerous ideology had been recognized before he had the chance to act on it. But such thoughts led nowhere productive. What happened, happened. All anyone could do now was honor the victims by ensuring their stories were told and their families supported. She visited the memorial that had been erected at the Skagit County Courthouse, a wall of names listing all of Whitmore's confirmed victims, with spaces left open for those still missing and unidentified. Elena's name was there, along with David's and Sophie's. Caroline brought fresh flowers every month, a ritual that helped her feel connected to her sister. That evening, back in her own home, Caroline sat with her family for dinner. Emma was in college now, studying criminal psychology in part because of what had happened to her aunt. James was a sophomore in high school, quieter than his sister but fiercely protective of his mother after watching what the investigation had put her through. "How did it go today?" Mark asked, passing the salad. "Good. Really good, actually." Owen remembered something happy about his family. He cried, which his therapist says is progress. "And how are you?" Mark's eyes held the kind of gentle concern he'd shown throughout the entire ordeal. "I'm okay. It was hard being up there again, but it felt right, like we were taking that place back from Whitmore's shadow." After dinner, Caroline went to her office. No longer a command center for investigation, but just a normal home office where she worked on her advocacy projects. The walls held family photos now instead of evidence. Photos of Elena from before, smiling and vital. Photos of Sophie and Owen as children. Photos of David with his arm around his wife. And newer photos, too. Owen at the group home, attempting a smile. The 5 survivors at a support group meeting. Families of victims at memorial services, supporting each other through shared grief. The story of the Cascade Shepherd had a ending now. Not a happy one. Too much had been lost for that. But an ending nonetheless. The mystery solved. The perpetrator identified. The victims remembered. What came after wasn't an ending, but a continuation. Owen learning to exist outside the Shepherd's framework. Survivors building new lives from the wreckage of the old. Families finding ways to honor their loved ones while also moving forward. Caroline's phone buzzed with a text from Owen. "Thank you for today. Made a shelf for my new rock collection. It feels good to have hobbies again. She smiled, typing back, I'm proud of you. Love you. A pause, then, love you too, Aunt Caroline. Still learning what that means, but I think I'm getting there. Caroline set down her phone and looked out the window at the mountains visible in the distance, their peaks touched by the last light of sunset. For 16 years, those mountains had represented mystery and loss. Now they represented something else: survival, resilience, and the long, difficult work of healing. The wilderness had taken so much, but it had also given up its secrets, allowed its victims to be found and named and mourned. And in the end, that had to be enough.